so much to Shannon and Dan and Jonathan for presenting today and giving us a kind of CEQA primer for all of us that are kind of either part of or adjacent to our regional forest and fire capacity block grant through the Department of Conservation. So for those of you who don't know, that's been awarded to Napa RCD, Colusa, Solano, Yolo RCDs, as well as Clerk in Lake County. And as a part of this, we're working on building our regional capacity to be getting more projects shovel ready. And we know one area that we could all benefit from is getting a more solid handle on kind of all of the ins and outs of CEQA and environmental compliance. The ways that we all interface with this is quite different. Maybe it's just working with contractors or, different kind of facets of the process, but we thought that this would be kind of a nice starting point for us all to be on the same page. And some of you on the call might not work directly in the forestry space, but we think that this will be useful more broadly across all of our staff. So the hope is this will be as engaging as a presentation as possible. We want to encourage question asking and discussion. I pasted the agenda in the chat for those of you who joined more recently. I'm hoping that you can still see the previous chat history and access that, but let me know if not. And throughout the presentation, feel free to put questions into the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that and helping to facilitate question and answers during the question and answer portions of the agenda. And actually, maybe really quickly, I'll just show you all the agenda so we can just kind of look at that briefly together. So yeah, starting out with just some introductions, then Jonathan will take us through kind of history and regulations of CEQA. Dan will talk through project development considerations. We'll take some time for question and answers. Then Shannon will give us an overview of Cal VTP and kind of some more specific Cal Fire processes. And then we will have some more time for question and answer and discussion. So I know it's a long day, but really excited and appreciative of the time that Cal Fire is putting into this and supporting us all. So yeah, thank you all. And in lieu of doing introductions of everyone on this call, I'd love if the trainee attendees could just introduce yourself in the chat, your name, what organization you work for, and maybe what kind of program area you typically work in, whether it's forestry or otherwise. And part of the hope long term is that we can all use each other as resources as we're collectively working through these processes. So want this to be a starting point for us all to chat and collaborate more. And then Shannon, do you want to do some quick introductions of all the Cal Fire folks?
Sure. So I'll start off. My name is Shannon Johnson, and I am our Vegetation Management Program Manager. And then I am also currently assisting with our environmental protection and our cultural resource management programs. I'll let John go next.
Okay, yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is John Fitch, and I am relatively new to the department. I came on board here with CAL FIRE in 2020, and then just this last October, I promoted to my current position where I work for Shannon out of the Sacramento office. So my title is Prescribed Fire Coordinator, and really that position I see it as a bridge. It's a bridge between the kind of the policy world and what we have going on the Sacramento level, and then out in the field. So most of my experience is on the ground forestry, whether it's applied, forest management or firefighting up in the state of Oregon. But I am from California originally, grew up here in Santa Rosa, and I live here now in Santa Rosa. Came back in 2017 on the Nuns and Tubbs fire, and that was my first real introduction back to Cal Fire, and said, hey, I think I want to come home. So I got my RPF license, long story short, and then in, like I said, 2020 joined up with Cal Fire. So it's been a fun ride, but happy to be here today.
And good morning. I'm Dan Craig. I'm the Northern Region for CAL FIRE Northern Region BMP Forcer 2. So the coordinator here out of the North Region. So I work with and support all the units that you probably work with. Most of you probably with Lake Napa, Tim Holiday. So and when they have questions, they reach out and ask me questions. And our role here at Region is simply to support the units in any way we can to help them get the projects approved and through the system. As there's changes, as there's questions, we try to get that information out and keep everybody moving. So, we're in close contact, or I'm in close contact with the unit. My background, I'm a registered professional forester. My background primarily has been in the force practice world. And about four years ago, it's about right, Shannon, I came over to the CEQA side, and it was eye-opening, just the difference between CEQA and the force practice world of just because the force practice world is regulatory in nature, so it has a process involved where CEQA doesn't. So that's where I'm enjoying the CEQA world, and I'm excited to give you guys some insight on what some of the stuff that I've learned. So that's me.
So yeah, I think we can go ahead and kick things off right on schedule.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in first here with, and everybody can see my screen, okay? Let's get a little, let's go. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, well, yeah, good morning, everybody. So I like that. To keep this engaging as possible, I put that in quotes, Allison. So here's my best effort. So bear with me, as it does look like I'm just talking to a screen. So if there's a question or a thumbs up, I can get every once in a while just so I know that I have I'm talking to some live people. That's great. But we'll work through this. I'll try to keep it as lighthearted and entertaining as possible, but kind of get into what the California Environmental Quality Act is, or CEQA. So like Dan said, as foresters, we're intimately acquainted with the forest practice rules, and that is functionally equivalent, or a THP is functionally equivalent of a CEQA document. But it kind of fits into the CEQA world. So when we're talking fuels management, this is our bread and butter. This is how we get to those shovel-ready projects. And so I'm excited to kind of open up that can of worms. All right, ready to go. So really what it is, CEQA is, it requires public agencies to look before they leap and say before they play. So really it's taking that analysis of what are we doing and what's the issues with that. Either there are issues or there aren't. And then if there are, how do we address those? And then also just as important is disclosing to the public so that there's transparency on what the public agency, us as public servants, are doing with public resources, whether it's money or land or just, as a public agency, we work for the people of California. So it really is the journey, kind of like Dan's saying, there's a process to all this stuff. So we'll kind of unpack this. My goal for today, and my couple portions here, is to kind of give you the what it is guideline, understanding that it is a process, and then we'll zoom out and really get into that process step by step. So here goes. All right. So before we get too deep, the CEQA guidelines, you're probably all familiar with it. I think you can see my screen. I am holding the 2021 version of the CEQA guidelines. There is, this is the Code of Regulations of California, and it's all written down there. It's in the PRC. So this is a great reference, but as you'll see, we get into it and start reading it. It does not read very smoothly. It has a number of court decisions and interpretations. It's written intentionally to be broad and semi-vague so that there can be open dialogue and discussion about how it's interpreted, which is good and bad, right? It's not black and white. There is a process to get through it and a process to kind of evaluate where you are and then to move forward as climate's change socially and environmentally. CEQA kind of evolves with that. So for better or worse, that's what it is. And that's our world, our operating world that we get to be a part of. So we can dive in on that, but that's getting into the philosophy of CEQA. And really, again, getting back to this intent, it's to inform the decision makers and also the public of the potential effects that are proposed. So really focusing on what we're doing as fuel management. What are we up to as government decision makers and people beholden to our basically our community that we have decided we want to serve as public servants. So it gives the community a voice in land use decisions, and it requires those decision makers to adopt alternatives or mitigation measures. So a lot of words. I mean, I think this group's probably aware of what those words mean. You know, decision makers, alternatives, mitigation measures. Of these kind of CEQA at ease, you could say, because it's not normal English. At least it doesn't appear that way to me. So we'll keep going. What is the point? Get to the point already. So it's to inform those decision makers. So I think we kind of beat that over the head already, and I'll keep making that point because really that is the intent. The point that is to inform those decision makers and the public of those environmental effects. So this CEQA also kind of generates through the process. It generates information to share with the public to kind of say, hey, here's what we're doing, and here's these impacts, and here's why we think it's no big deal, or here's why we think it's a big deal but it's worth it, or here's why it's a big deal and here's how we can mitigate those big deals. Because at the end of the day, we want to do XYZ. You know, we want to do this fuel reduction project. We want to open up this ridge, which we understand there's issues with that, but the pros outweigh the cons. So we're disclosing all that information to the public, and CEQA is the pathway to get to there, so that there's no wool being pulled over, a citizen's eyes. So also the point is it keeps us from being sued. So that is an important part of CEQA. You'll see here straight out of the CEQA guidelines, it's a self-executing statute, meaning there's no such thing as the CEQA police. We are the CEQA police. But what that means is if we're not doing our jobs, we can be taken to court and held accountable, kind of hung up on that tree. And so that's the point, is to keep us on track, to keep us, honest with our analysis. And couple links here to some CEQA stuff. There's a ton of stuff online, and it really is a can of worms. And looking at it, just objectively, it does look confusing. So we'll get into kind of the process, in the next phase. But I think it's important to kind of just really understand that CEQA is a self-executing and know what that means. It's like it's up to us to make those determinations and to justify those determinations. And so that's really what CEQA is to kind of put forth in good faith, hey, here's our due diligence for why we came up with our analysis and why we think this project and this potential impact is worth the risk, or here's why we think this impact is there, and we're going to do XYZ to avoid that risk, and here's how we think we can do that. So also, it keeps us from being sued. So that's really the goal, is to keep projects on track, because I think as land managing practitioners and stewards of the environment, speaking personally, our goal is to do good work, to keep our habitats healthy, resilient, to keep our communities protected, but also to protect our sensitive environments that we call home, that we're a part of, and that we care about deeply. I mean, I think it takes a special person to be drawn to natural resource management, and this journey, this process is certainly just that. It's a process and a journey, and so it's a labor of love to get through this. So here's the history of CEQA. It traces back to the 1970s, kind of came out of a public outcry, so to speak, at the national level, where there was just tons of perceived environmental degradation going on. So the freeway boom, a bunch of dams and levees being put in, in 1969, NEPA was enacted, and so this followed shortly thereafter in 1970, signed by Governor Reagan. And it kind of models the NEPA process where it requires those public agencies, those decision makers, to kind of say before they play, so to speak, to kind of really disclose what it is we're up to, why we're doing it, and how we got to this decision. And then understanding too, okay, you saw that statutes, we're talking, it's constantly being amended. So the courts weigh in all the time, and there's a list of numerous dates in there. You know, the most recent one, 2019. So it's constantly changing. And so I think that's not new to anybody probably that's here, but it's just something to always be aware of. And CEQA kind of is a living entity. It changes through time, and it's going to continue to change as the public weighs in on what they think is important. So, getting back to that summary, what does that all mean? Everything I just said. So we really we got to mitigate those impacts when feasible. The lead agency, and again, we'll get into what a lead agency is and how a lead agency kind of operates. So they're the ones that are responsible for the compliance. And again, the compliance component, it's all up to us as the lead agency to ensure compliance. There's no CEQA jail, but there is the courtroom, and that might as well be the same thing. So it's multidisciplinary in scope, meaning it crosses all numerous resource objectives, kind of the full array of what's out there. And again, that's probably not new to anybody in this webinar. And then that's that enforcement piece, enforced by litigation. And it's all open and transparent. So everything we do, the public's not just aware of it, but they're encouraged to participate in. Certainly when we get to the environmental impact reports, there is numerous opportunities for the public to engage in mandated public comment periods, as you're aware. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's really the summary of CEQA. So with that, I mentioned the CEQA ease. I think it's important to kind of have a basic understanding of what all these words mean, because they, again, reading through it, I don't know how often I heard ministerial until you start getting into the CEQA world. Like, what is that? Is that some, mid dark ages feudal system word? Maybe it came from there, but that word ministerial really is the government decision involving little or no personal judgment. So it's a process, right? It's the thing. I think of it as a good old crowning king saying, "Hey, you shall do this or you shall do that." There's not a lot of judgment call. This is the way it is. And then there's the discretionary word, which really gets to the decision and the judgment or deliberation. Lead agency, we'll get a little more into that. Also responsible agency. So an agency that might not have the final say, but an agency that's responsible to weigh in. And you see that quite often with the timber harvesting rule set, the forest practice rules, but it also comes into play for CEQA, because there's times where you need to consult with Department of Fish and Wildlife or other resource agencies that have an obligation to weigh in, whether it's for permitting or other reason. And then obviously the public, that's probably the most important bullet point on here. They are the recipient of the information, the keeper of all things. It's who we serve as public servants and civil servants. We serve the public. That's our job, is to do our best to engage this process, to put good science and applied management on the ground in a way that's meaningful and important. And I'll leave it at that. Okay, an impact, we kind of have an understanding what an impact is. I think we all know what that is. And then the word feasible, and that comes into play because we can propose everything, but if it's not feasible, then it's not worth doing. And then the last definition I want to touch on is project.
Okay.
In a project, we are going to.
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody all right over there? Sorry, I can't quite see my. So project is a government action carried out, supported, or approved by the public agency. And we're going to come back to this because this is where the CEQA process begins. And this is where our journey sort of starts. So once we have a project, we begin through this system of analysis to determine what it is we're going to do with that kind of goal in mind. So whether we carry it out, something we do ourselves as an agency, we support, so that could be funded. So any kind of time there's a grant funding going out that's public money, we have an obligation to make sure we follow this set of laws and rules. Or anytime we issue a permit for something, that's the stamp of approval saying, hey, yeah, this agency, or our agency is the lead agency, the one having discretion, says this is the way to go. We have an obligation to go through this process. And so just for an example, CAL FIRE's example there through the bottom of the screen, anything we do, carrying out fuel reduction treatments, constructing, improving, or maintaining facilities, doing training exercise, even that have a potential to impact the environment, and then grants or approving timber harvest plans. Those are all actions that CAL FIRE takes on that invoke the CEQA rules. And so how we address that is how we walk through the CEQA process to make sure we're compliant. Again, a lot of this stuff will be repeated, and so I will try not to bore everybody, but it's a process. And so when we understand, okay, we're moving from point A to point B, our current situation to our desired future condition, that's our project, right? We're trying to get through this and do the appropriate analysis. So what is that analysis? What does that look like? How do we get there? And how do we do that? So invariably, I mean, as I was kind of learning this even in school, I went to Cal Poly, graduated in just a couple years ago, early 2000s. I remember learning about CEQA for the first time and being like, this is a nightmare. Who came up with this? What is this? But when you start to see, okay, here's the intent, and those topics I touched on a little bit ago, there is a real need for us to be good stewards of these resources we're entrusted with. So we can sit and talk pros and cons about CEQA all day long, but the reality is this is our operating world. So as soon as we embrace this and understand it, then we can move forward along that track. So as you start with your project, we're going to go through this journey to determine what our output is. And our output's going to be our environmental document, an approved environmental document. So it's going to look like three different things. It could be an exemption, a negative declaration, or a mitigated neg deck, or a full-blown environmental impact report. And I say full-blown, and that has the implication that that's somehow broader or more in-depth level of review, which could or could not mean that. So it's just those are the three options, and you'll see that as we walk through this. So with that, so that's kind of all the background. I'm going to talk briefly now about how we get through this process, and then we'll take a quick break and we'll dive into that process step by step, a little bit more in depth. So that's kind of our track here for the next couple minutes. This is a different world. I think I've alluded to that. And for example, this is a quote pulled right out of the good old CEQA guidelines that you read it and you're like, at least for me, if you're like me, it just causes you to scratch your head. So I'm just going to read this because it doesn't sound like something that could be in an official policy language. So once the lead agency has determined that an activity is a project subject to CEQA, a lead agency shall determine whether the project is exempt from CEQA. So that is written down. That's CEQA. That's part of this process, and it is confusing, at least if you are like me. And so that's why it's important to really take a step back, try to understand this one step at a time. And so that's what we're going to do. It seems like a trap, it seems like a web of just a jungle, but it really is a framework for moving through this analysis piece. And when we start to look at it as a way we can move through these balls and get away from some of these more complex jargony terms that seem to hang people, at least like me, up. So here's this flow chart. I think you may have a link to this somewhere. And we're going to get through this step by step here in the next point. But I want to put this up here now just so you can have a look at this. And again, when I was in school, I remember looking at this flow chart and just being like, wow, this is what we came up with, huh? For how we do environmental analysis. This is it. We can't come up with something a little more streamlined. And I think it really is pretty streamlined when you break it down, but it's a journey, and it requires that disclosure, and it requires some work. So I kind of broke it out into 3 parts there, 3 distinct phases, if you will, along that journey. And one is to figure out if we have a project, and then determine if it's exempt. We'll get into the different types of exemptions. Then once we figure out it's not exempt, we do an initial study to figure out where we go from there. And then once we do that, we go down those routes of a negative declaration, a mitigated neg dec, or an EIR. And then we end up with a document that we take back to our agency's person that makes a determination whether it's yay or a nay, and we have an approved document, and there we go. We have our shovel ready project ready to go move some dirt or do some work. So all right. So quickly here, a couple different exemptions. We've got statutory exemptions, categorical exemptions, and we'll break those down a little bit more in the next presentation. But something to be aware: statutory are written and granted by legislature, and categorical are written in the guidelines, and they're exempt by category. And we'll get through that a little bit more. I have references to the sections in the guidelines there. You can look at your pleasure later. So once we figure out it is not exempt by either of those options, we go through an initial study. And this is based on Appendix G, or it's not based on that. The Appendix G is based on the initial study. It's written out of, the laws, rules say, hey, we got to do this analysis. And thankfully, we have a guideline there in the actual guidelines. They actually guide us through that process of the initial study. So if we follow that Appendix G, and again, this is where each agency can kind of tweak it to their needs. At the end of the day, Appendix G is a great starting point to do your initial study. And it kind of does all these things here, determining basically at the end of the day what type of environmental document you need. So we're going to check here as we get through this process. And again, that initial study, if it will not have a significant effect, we can do a negative declaration. If it and there's those 3 levels. Mitigation will lessen the effect to a significant level, then we can do a mitigated negative declaration. But if the project will have a significant environmental effect, we can go through an environmental impact report. And notice that if there is an impact, it doesn't derail this whole process. It just means we disclose that and we analyze that and we figure out, okay, is this impact worth that risk? And so that's the process, right? And again, all through this, we're staying out of hot water in the courts and staying out of the courtroom and staying out on the ground doing the work itself. So that's that. Determinations and managing risk. So that goes into this analysis, right, of how we work through the process. Remembering the point of, we're informing our decision makers, both in our internal, agency, kind of to ourselves, that's ourselves, and the public, about the effects of the project. And it's to solve those environmental impacts if possible, or, to consider alternatives. What are alternatives to these impacts? And that's we're going to get into that more, but I think it's important to kind of have that, the point fresh in our minds as we're kind of working through this system of how we get there. So we'll keep pressing on here. I think another terms you'll hear in the CEQA world is this fair argument standard, and also this what is substantial evidence. It gets to this initial study of when we're doing this. When do we kind of kick it up to that next level, so to speak? When do we do an EIR And it really comes down to what can be fairly argued. And that is super vague and super open to interpretation. And again, that's where the courts come in. And that's where understanding, okay, what have the courts done in the past? That will lead us to where we are today. And certainly when there's a new interpretation, then, that will change. And so to me, that I don't like that answer, because it's not black and white. It does require a level of justification, and it's not clean and tidy, but it does afford the public a great opportunity to weigh in, and also for science to stay up to date with the current trends, to keep modern science backing up what we're doing. Because I do think at the end of the day, we all want to not have a negative impact on the world. So that's the goal. So we stayed on target. We stayed on target. Got through all that. Got through that analysis. Worked through our substantial evidence part, and boom, there we are. We've got the Death Star exploded. We're ready for work. We've got our notice of exemption, or we've got our environmental impact report, or where somewhere in the middle there, that negative declaration and mitigated negative declaration. Again, I think it's important to understand that the administrative record that kind of shows that track record and kind of can justify why we're staying true to the analysis that have been done. But that's the CEQA process. We navigated it. So well done, everybody. Thanks for staying with me. What is the time frames of these things? And understand that these time frames that are listed up here are ballpark. There's definitely times where you might be able to go a little faster. The EIR is going to be probably the lengthier journey, because it has that requirement to justify why you are having some significant impacts potentially, and that might mean you have to do surveys, and those could be time sensitive or season sensitive. If you're putting together a project now in mid June, and you need to survey for a sensitive species sometime in April or May, you're gonna have to wait to the next year to do those surveys, and that could be some time as you put this process together. But understand that might not be enough time. You might need to wait for approval from a certain agency. You might have to deal with a global pandemic, and who knows what. I think these timeframes probably existed online before the days of COVID. So we're got a whole new world. What does not change, however, is the mandatory public review periods. That is written down in the guidelines, and that will remain the same. So your negative declarations and your mitigated negative decks, that's a 30-day public review period. There is no review period for exemptions, and then you can see the numerous periods of public review for an EIR. So thank you guys all. We're working our way through this, and we're almost to the end of the first phase here. May the CEQA be with you. This is really a kind of this feeling as we work through this, and understanding it's been done before. People have done this since 1970, gotten through this successfully. So when we understand that, hey, we've got a track record, how do we work through that? Understand where the courts have been, what these decisions have been. Then we can kind of move with some confidence that we're on the right track. So the public process, where everybody has an opinion, and CEQA affords everyone an opportunity to weigh in. It gives the decision makers there's a need to balance those concerns with the adopted standards of the department or agency or community, and knowing full well, depending on where you're at in the state, you might have a very wide array of opinions on what should be done, what could be done, or what's just untenable. And at the end of the day, the courts have that say in how this is all interpreted. So we'll wrap it up here. It's a journey. We're going to break down this journey through that flow chart here in a minute, and we're going to stay lawsuit free and have some of those shovel ready projects ready to roll. So that's what we got for kind of a broad overview of CEQA, kind of what it is, and we're going to take a quick bio break here and maybe reconvene here in 5 minutes. That sound okay, Allison?
Sounds great. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
See some good questions coming through. So I'm logging all these for when we have our Q&A section. All right, maybe we can go ahead and kick things back off.
Yeah. No, those are good questions, especially I like Lucas's last question there. It's something I've wrestled with and certainly had numerous conversations over some beers about how that fits. So I will get to that a little bit, but I will continue on the journey here of the process of CEQA, and then we'll get to those questions. So okay, is that all good to go there?
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks everybody for your patience with the intro there of what CEQA is. I think it is a journey, it is a process, and so you can't really talk about CEQA without explaining that. So we're gonna take it a step farther now and really break down what that flow chart is. So feel free to have that flow chart there, that gnarly looking spider web thing. I mean, we'll break that down. I don't think it's probably new to anybody that's been around CEQA, but like I said, the first time I remember looking at that back in 2001 as a college student and just scratching my head like, wow, how does anybody get through this? Just seems so out there. So but I think when we work through it and break it down, there is a pathway, and clearly it has been done by very capable and skilled people in the past, and so we can do it. So let's grab this. So like I said, feel free to grab that, and we'll work through it. And heaven forbid we don't know where we are in this process. You can grab that good old California Environmental Quality Act CEQA guideline book, and it's right there in Appendix A. So it's there for us to enjoy. So let's do this journey. It's unexpected or expected journey, and some of the twists and turns may be unexpected, but I think everybody starts out feeling happy, right? We're going on this adventure. We want to do this fuel project. We want to go do something that may have an impact, but that is worth that impact, because we know if we do nothing, the impact of that is far greater. And so it's just us justifying that. Really, at the end of the day, it's us justifying why we're saying we're going to do this and why a potential impact might be worth that risk. It is a good distinction. I kind of alluded to the forest practice rules because, as an RPF or a forester, that is something that is kind of ingrained in us to stay consistent with this rule book. But there's specifics in there, like water bar spacing. There's basal area retention metrics. There's specific measurable silvicultural targets for residual stand retention, and so on and so forth. You open up the CEQA guidelines, and there's none of that. It just says, hey, don't do an impact, and if you do, try to mitigate that. So, for somebody that likes numbers and tangible metrics, it can be a challenge because it feels squishy. And so that's kind of the intent of CEQA is rather than fight that, I think it's good to recognize that, call that out, and then move forward looking at what's been done, where the courts have ruled in the past, and then moving forward, what are spelling out, okay, if we do nothing here, the impacts are far greater than us, putting this fuel break in. And so that's where that court and that self-executing statute provision comes into play. We are policing ourselves, and we're kind of calling the shots and just disclosing that along this journey. So we'll get into it here. And then I think it's fair to expect challenges. It's, if you're like me, the natural reaction is to kind of fear the hurdle, fear the challenge in our way, because sometimes there's no easy button, and we just have to keep trudging and keep grinding to get this done. So hopefully we stay litigation free, and if we do get litigated, it's not the end of the world either. There's reason for that, and I think learning around there. And, I think us, though, in the fuel reduction sector, forest stewardship sector, kind of stand a lot of, we have a lot of public support today, whereas even a few years ago, it might not have been true. Certainly when I came down and was a dozer boss on the Tubbs fire with my Oregon pickup, it was an interesting experience to kind of see the community start to understand, like, wow, okay, this is an issue. And then, fast forward to where we are today, year after year after year after year, having these fires that are completely disruptive to our culture here in Sonoma County and in the state. Okay, enough of a tangent there. All right, step 0, back on track. Establishing lead agency. This is kind of before we even start on that journey. We have to figure out who is the decider. And that's all lead agency is. They're the decider. They have the discretionary authority to make a decision on a project. There is the section in the PRC there, 15.367. And you can understand that CEQA has these definitions of what a public agency is and a local agency. And so just for clarity, I kind of highlighted a local agency is any public agency other than the ones listed there in the public agency definition. So if you meet those definitions, you're basically an agency and you have discretionary authority to make a decision, then you can be a lead agency. And you might have to pull in some consultations and show those consultations with responsible agencies like CDFW or CAL FIRE or whoever else if we're not the lead agency. But you certainly don't need CAL FIRE to be the lead agency every time. Certainly, we have our own limitations as internal policy and our own limitations, just sheer force of what we can do with the breadth of everything else going on that the department does. So step 1 of that flow chart, there it is. Public agency determines whether the activity is a project. So I said I'd come back to this, and this really kicks off the journey. This kicks off the process of working through that flow chart. If it's not a project, then we don't need to worry about it. We're done. But if it is a project, then we go. There's go time. Let's go on this journey, this adventure. So who is conducting, who is permitting or funding the project? Those are some critical questions to ask as we get started down that path. And really it comes down to the whole of the action. So meaning kind of all parts, the pre-work, the doing, and then that post part of the job. Are you cutting grass, mowing the lawn, or are you cutting the weeds with the masticator, and you've got some subswelling going on, trying to displace some of those breaking up those root wads to do whatever. If that's part of your project, then I think those are two very different actions. So I don't want to beat this up too much, and I want to get through the rest of the steps. So we're going to move on from project. I think we kind of have an understanding of that. So the CEQA is invoked when there's public funding. So that permitting and that conducting come into play for when CEQA is engaged. So step 2, we figure out if that project's exempt. So like that little quote I had in the last part, where you figure out if CEQA applies, and then you figure out if CEQA doesn't apply. That's essentially what that quote said. And this is that big step. If we can get through, if we can find an exemption for CEQA in CEQA, then there's a pathway to the end, to our notice of exemption. So if we get away from doing a full-blown review, that's what it means. That's what an exemption means. It means we are exempt from the CEQA review process. It's not exempt from CEQA. It's exempt from further review because it qualifies as an exemption to that very action, that very need for justifying what we're doing, because we have these set, distinct ways to call that out, whether it's statutory, and again, that could be a ministerial exemption, or a categorical exemption. And I'll go a little bit more depth here, starting with statutory. The ministerial exemption is an exempt by the statute and involves little personal judgment by the public agency. So that could be a building permit and or licenses. I'll stop short of saying anything more from that at this point, because there is continual discussion on how far that goes. But certainly anything that revolves little or no personal judgment is a ministerial exemption. And then again, there's the emergency kind of situation. So that's how us as an agency, CAL FIRE, can go put a 4-blade dozer line down a ridge behind a town, because we're if we had to go through that process, then there'd be more impacts, I think, than the public's okay with. And so that's how in the rule book, in the guidelines, that fits into there. So with that, I'm going to kind of keep trudging along. We can kind of come back to this if people have more questions in the Q&A section. And I'll briefly touch on some details here in the categorical side. So in the Public Resources Code, section 15.330, there's 33 categorical exemptions, and these are classes of exemptions that have been determined that are exempt from further review. It doesn't mean you pick it and you're done. You still might need to show why this applies, and so that's that due diligence. Some might call it scoping, some might call it justification. You still have to show, and this might again depend on your agency has their own procedures, but kind of demonstrate why you chose what you chose. For an example, a class 4, a minor alteration to landscape, that's probably the most common one that CAL FIRE uses for fuel reduction projects, but it might not be the most common one a different agency chooses to go with. So class 7, class 8, and class 32 are all, or 33 are all good categorical exemptions that could be used to fit fuel reduction work. One thing I want to briefly mention, if I'm going to back up now, I don't like doing that, but you'll see that that second blue line, the no possible significant effect, that's technically called a common sense exemption. And it's not written down, but I do want to touch on that so you don't call me a liar later when you say, hey, how come this guy never talked about that? That is something CAL FIRE just does not use, because I think there are maybe some challenges legally to kind of show that the burden of proof falls with the department to use that. And we have these other mechanisms to find exemptions, whether it's ministerial or categorical. So that's as much as I'll say there. And sorry if that causes more questions, but I think I'm going to move on in the interest of time. But just be aware that is a thing that you might see other agencies using. So with that, I'm going to move right into exceptions to the exemption. So of course, it's not without caveats, these exemptions. And there's 6 kind of exceptions to using an exemption. What might kick us out of the exemption ability and into launching into the next phase, which will be the initial study. And so this is where that due diligence is required to ensure we're compliant with the law. Are we passing that red face test? Are we being honest with our constituents, with our public partners, saying, hey, yeah, we're doing everything we can to ensure that this process is being followed? Because if this were not the case, we could be out there willy-nilly doing stuff. And that's certainly what happens in other states. And again, I don't want to derail the conversation further, but from my experience up in another state, Oregon to our north, there's no CEQA equivalent, and sometimes you just wonder what the government's up to. So in California, you don't have to wonder; it's there, and there is a process. So good or bad, that's what we've got, and this due diligence piece will speak to if we can find that exemption or not and justify the use of that. So what happens? If your project is exempt for the ministerial exemption, so you get that little permit or you get that license or you get whatever it is, then you're done. You've got that thing. You don't need to go farther than that. You're through CEQA. Congratulations, you found the fast track. Now that fits a very specific set of actions. And so if your project though is exempt per a categorical exclusion, then you need to file a notice of exemption. And understand, well, you don't technically, the guidelines say a notice of exemption can be filed. And if it is filed, there's the section 15.11.12 that outlines statutes of limitations for when another group or another organization can file a grievance, so to speak. I'm probably using the wrong word, but that statute of limitations basically is the days following approval. So somebody in our agency is going to sign off on this exemption, and 35 days filing or past us actually filing the day, that's the limitation for when another group can say, hey, we disagree that an exemption fits in the situation, and we're taking you to court to fight you. If you do not post that, if you do not file that, then it's 180 days following agency approval. So that's a distinction that is good to know, that once the exemption has been approved by your agency, you can just go get to work, knowing that, okay, you've got 180 days. If you don't file it, whether it's through the state clearinghouse or the county, before a group can come and kind of argue with you and say, hey, we think you weren't being straightforward, or your due diligence is not sufficient. And then 35 days if you do file it. So that's just part of the rule. So, okay, we'll get back to our flow chart here. Where are we at? We are, great. We've made it through one box. And so I always feel like, man, so much work goes into figuring out if your project's exempt or not. You should be farther along. And we're just right there. So you'll find more agencies and departments have their flow charts. This is what I found from Caltrans, and a good little tool to work through if is a project exempt or not. You'll see. Here's my little, see if this works. Yeah, here's my little pointer here. Here's our project. Figure out if exempt. If it's statutory or not. Then we go into the 33 classes. If it's not, this is something CAL FIRE doesn't do. This is, like I said, common sense. Pretend that doesn't exist for this PowerPoint, but no, it is there built into CEQA. And we'll go launch right into that initial study. But Caltrans might use that, so that's why I wanted to at least mention that, because you may see that in the CEQA world, and I didn't think it'd be fair to not at least disclose that. Okay, so that's where we're at. We're through the exemptions. Now we're into step 3, which is the initial study. And we basically figure out, now this is where that heavy lift of doing some broader analysis. Again, you might want to do that analysis to justify why you chose a notice of exemption. So you're not like out of the woods completely by doing an exemption. You still have to kind of show your due diligence why you chose that. And certainly each agency might have their own process for how that fits. But you can see here in those brown boxes, there's a list of stuff you've got to do. And thankfully, we've got that Appendix G to guide us through that. And here it is. This is just cut and paste right out of Appendix G, right out of the guidelines. And you basically have this substantial evidence, component of figuring out if there's an impact or not. So you have these you see those environmental factors potentially affected. So here's my little my thing here. You go through this entire list of resources, figure out what the impact is, if it is potentially significant or all the way to no impact. And then you basically come up with this report, and that will guide you on this journey. So again, kind of that substantial evidence component. This is where I think Dan is going to get into a little more detail about how this works out. Again, this is that scoping piece. This is that heart of the analysis to CEQA, and this is where you can kind of take some twists and turns in what you find. And you might start thinking, oh, okay, yeah, we've got no impact, and then as you go out there and do the surveys, do your due diligence, you find, oh, you've got a sensitive species. Now we got to protect for it, which is really a good thing, right? We all, I think, as public stewards want to do the right thing. So if we find something that, if there's an area we can improve on, then I think we all want to do that. So I'm going to keep moving through this just in the interest of time, so we do have some opportunities for question and answer. But again, what is substantial evidence is not an argument or speculation. It's all substantiated on science. And so those new studies we have, certainly, our partners with the higher learning, it's great to kind of study this emerging field of fuels management in today's day and age in the midst of climate change. So understanding too, we've got the context to deal with, and this is ever changing. You know, depending on, there's a little graphic there. If we're the guy on the land and we see a boat, we're stoked. But if we're in that little boat and we see land, we're pumped equally for totally opposite reasons. So you're doing this analysis, and this is where that CEQA can get squishy. And I say squishy in the best possible sense of the word, because there's room for that justification and making intelligent arguments for why you think something's justified and or not justified. That image down in the bottom there, I think it's out of a Simpsons episode where they talked. It was basically, I don't know the whole context of that, but it was a clear cut, some massively detrimental environmental impact, but you put rainbows and happy smiley animals, and then it kind of conveys this thing that, oh, it's not a big deal. But we know if we do that due diligence, what we're going to find for something that is bad. So we'll talk briefly about the thresholds of significance. I think this is probably not new to the group, but it is important to understand that these thresholds can be found not just, they can be found multiple places. They can be found in the CEQA guidelines and general plans communities have to plans that departments have. The municipal code, it's adopted to development standards, and those all get to, okay, where is that line of what is significant and or not. So here's another graphic. Again, this is probably nothing new. But that proposed action, is it over that threshold or is it under that threshold? And how did it get under that threshold? Is it there just because that's where it is, or is it there because we had some applied mitigation measures put there? So that's all kind of the behind the scenes, working through this initial study and figuring out, okay, where are we going to go from there? And that will lead us right into step 4, where we choose our path. This journey, right? We've embarked on that journey. When we left the door, going down this road, we didn't know where we'd end up. Might have had an idea, but that initial study is going to kind of paint us, direct us in the right way. And so it could lead somewhere. It's going to lead to that negative declaration. It's going to lead to the mitigated neg deck or an environmental impact statement. Okay, again, we're gonna get through this pretty quick here. The negative declaration just show where that initial study shows there's no substantial evidence, considering the whole of the record, that the project has a significant effect. Negative. We've done the study, we've done the justifications, and we've shown through these consultations, through these studies, through these surveys, that we don't have an impact. Mitigated neg deck. So we have no impact after these mitigations are put in place, and we have to show that. So we avoid, we minimize, we rectify, reduce, and we compensate. And we all know about that. So I'm going to leave that there and move right along. Environmental impact reports. So here it is. This is kind of what everybody fears, but I do think it has kind of a misnomer that there's options where this is just the best way to go, because you show why you're taking an impact and you get through it. The reality is a fuel reduction project's never going to probably get kicked up to this level, because we're going to tier into an already approved EIR, and Shannon will touch on that in a little bit. I think you're all probably aware of a new bright shiny tool in our toolbox called the Cal VTP, which is an approved programmatic EIR for fuel reduction work. And if we stay consistent with that, this is done. We're done with this environmental piece. We just have to prepare a project specific analysis to show we're consistent, and then we're good to go. So with that, we're going to kind of keep powering through, because that is that. And again, here's that reference to the program or master EIRs. And there are different EIR types, but they are still the same document. So you have subsequent, supplement, master, programmatic, project EIRs, and then addendum to those EIRs. And that just kind of tells me, when you see that list like that, I think that shows that this that the CEQA journey can have some twists and some turns, and it doesn't have to be a one size fits all model. But if we're keeping the public informed, we're being transparent with how we're doing our analysis and what those results of those analysis are, we're on a firm footing to get to our end result of having an approved environmental document and one that's going to hold up in court or pass that red face test when or if a crazy person says, hey, we're out in left field doing something we shouldn't be doing. If we can point back to these documents and say, hey, here's our process, then we're solid. All right, so where are we at now? We're right in the middle of that web. We've gone through that. We've determined if we need to do that, that initial study. We've chosen our pathway. We're in that public review process, and that is going to be this next step. And understand that in here, in this whole consultation web, it doesn't necessarily have to follow a specific path. There can be some non-linear parts to this. It goes back and forth. There's opportunities for weigh-in, buy-in, and all this stuff can be documented, right? With his, formal letters to just email correspondence and how stuff works. And again, we're going to go to step 5, the public review. I've touched on this briefly. There is mandatory public review periods for those various environmental documents, the exemptions. There's no public review period. You approve that. There are limitations on when other organizations can kind of throw the penalty flag, but and that gets to when if it's filed or not. But there's no necessary public review period. So a mitigated neg deck and a neg deck do have that there's 30 days there, and then up to 85 days for an EIR. And again, this is really that full disclosure piece built into the guidelines to show us that, hey, we've got some obligations to the public. And over there in the far corner there, you'll see here, I'll let you all read that in your own time, but it's just kind of intuitive pros and cons about engaging with the public. You're going to get some off the wall comments. But you can respond to those appropriately. And you're also probably going to get, with fuel reduction, at least some support, I would imagine. That's been my experience recently, is everybody is wanting more of this. That's kind of aware or been living in fire impacted communities. So here's the EIR public review part. You'll see those little, I was going to call them, the yellow, that's the color I'm looking for. The yellow bubbles that the public is very much included along that pathway as it goes through. There's, the draft layer, there's public meetings, agency, public input, and you get to the final layer, you get more input, and then you get to certification and project approval. So we'll kind of leave that public involvement there, and if you have more questions, we'll hope to have time to address that in the Q&A. Step 6, monitoring. This is part of CEQA, is this ongoing monitoring. So tying it back to our Cal VTP, and not wanting to jump the gun, but that Cal VTP has been approved, right? And it has the mitigation monitoring reporting program associated with it. That's the Appendix A of the Cal VTP. And that's where you get at how do we make sure and ensure that these impacts stay mitigation, or that these impacts, or mitigation are in place. And once that's in place, so you've gone through the process, you've gotten to the bottom of that file now you get to that determination. And I can't read determination without seeing the determinator. So apologize for that terrible joke. But it is what it is. So we made this determination, and that is, there's probably going to be somebody in your department that is the final signatory on that choice. And so if you're CAL FIRE, it goes from the units, and then it goes to Dan at the region level, and then it goes to Shannon in Sacramento, who are both right here, and then it goes on up to our deputy director, Matthew Reichman, and he will sign these things. And Shannon's, hopefully she's not shaking her head and wondering why I'm going down that rabbit hole, but just so you know, there's a final decision that gets made, and then you have an approved project. So that last step, this could be a step with the flow chart, is we're kind of off the flow chart, but then we file it. And just know that when we get to filing, there's various fees. Well, most of them are imposed by CDFW, and they go to kind of fund their monitoring programs and their compliance issues with various stuff. So they do change from year to year, and there is a $50 county clerk fee. And whether you file with state clearinghouse or you stay with the county clerk will depend on your agency. That's some of the internal stuff. I do think it's important to reference at least Assembly Bill 819. That was just approved January 1, or it was approved January 1, it was effective January 1, 2022, approved in 2021. And basically the goal is to modernize CEQA so that these public postings can be found online, whether there's an agency website or more of like, so if you're filing with Cal VTP, it will go to the Board of Forestry's website and be put on there for review. Just that's an approved document. So I don't know if that's kind of spinning out of control here, but just know Assembly Bill 819 is kind of trying to modernize some of those practices. So we're getting to the end. We're getting close, folks. So thank you for staying with me this whole time. This is the John Fitch attempt to simplify things, and basically my takeaway is this is the journey that Frodo Baggins has taken from project inception through the CEQA pathway, and then you're going to result. So you start here, boom, your proposed action, figure out if it's a project, walk down this train and come out with a NOE, neg deck, a mitigated neg deck, or an EIR. And then you're going to be there. You're going to be at the end. And so that is it. That's CEQA, how it evaluates those changes in the environment. And that agency, whether it's yourselves or CAL FIRE or whoever is that lead agency, evaluates those changes. And that's the process. You got through that? Well done. Thanks for staying with me at this point. We'll see if we still have people tuned in or not, but that's what we got. Thank you. How we doing out there?
Good. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, John.
Awesome.
I'll go live so you can see there's people still here.
Never know.
So we can take a little break before we get into the next presentation. I don't know, our moderator went.
When do we get to ask questions?
I have to look at the agenda, but if you have some questions while there's a period right now, a break, I don't see why you can't ask a question. Maybe Jonathan and I can answer.
Yeah, that works. If you want to go ahead and ask your question now, we also have a few that I've been capturing.
Hi, this is Catherine from Solano RCD, and my question is regards to when do you determine to do a negative deck versus a mitigated neg deck. A lot of our projects, because we're doing habitat restoration projects in addition to fire resiliency, we have, as part of just our project description, many things that might be considered a mitigation measure. We survey for birds before we do any, it's incorporated into our actual project. And so one of the things that I've wondered is, could we just get by with a negative deck because our project description, as our standard operating procedures, encompasses all of these protections for special status species? Or if that kicks you into a mitigated neg deck and your standard project description tasks end up becoming sort of the mitigation measures. Maybe it's a moot point because it's about the same filing fee either way, but for some reason I just hate to call it a mitigated neg deck when it just should be a negative deck, in my opinion.
So I don't know if Shannon wants to jump in on this. So with my experience is most everything, it kind of boils down to the interpretation of, is it a mitigation or is it a best management practice? For the most part, when I review stuff and read through things, the way people present it kind of can change whether that's the negative or a mitigated negative deck, just how they present that language. I prefer to call it a mitigated negative deck because it's on a safer side, where I think we're being a little bit more clear that we're actually providing some kind of mitigation, especially if it reads like a deferred. Like, we've done surveys, we haven't seen anything, but we all know, plants bloom at certain periods, or birds and mammals can be transient in nature and come into the area. So maybe 6 months down the road or a year down the road, we say something like we're going to do more surveys, or do an initial, or do a look again to make sure nothing's there. We've already made the statement that that our project's not going to have an effect because we know nothing's there. But then on the other side, we're saying if something does occur, or a year down the road, if something does show up, we're going to look for it, and then we're going to do this. So that kind of puts it in my mind, the way I look at it, it puts me into a mitigated negative deck, because I'm giving an action to if something occurred, right? If it was a one-time thing and the species isn't there and you're not deferring anything, then you could probably look at a negative deck. But now I got Shannon's attention, so she might have a different view on that. So.
No, I was just going to agree. And usually for like a negative declaration, you can say with confidence that you're not having an impact on anything. And so I think for us, the reason why most of our documents are mitigated versus a negative declaration is the fact that, you are doing surveys prior to, you have done them before, and you were saying like you potentially, based on your analysis, aren't going to have an impact, but you're still going to survey ahead of time, and you have these avoidance measures and things like that. But it's that, like, you're not going to have an impact, and everything in that that negative declaration would essentially be no impact, no impact, no impact. And if you have a species present and you're doing avoidance measures, or that you're surveying ahead of time, I think for us it's more because we have those avoidance measures and they are best management practices. We're saying it's a mitigated negative declaration versus a true negative declaration. So that's kind of the route that we take with them.
Thanks for clarifying that. That makes sense to me. And then when you have a mitigated neg deck, you also then have a monitoring protocol that you're following. So it's sort of, it's forcing you to take it more seriously, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So I guess just one quick follow-up question then. I hope I'm not monopolizing too much here and that this is relevant to everyone else. So then when you have a negative deck versus a categorical exemption, sometimes we have, something that sort of overlaps between the two. Do you guys generally go for a negative declaration rather than the categorical exemption just because you're playing it safe again? Or what do you do when there's this overlap between those two?
No, we do more our projects fall in both, but we tend not to utilize negative declarations. We either do a categorical or we do mitigated neg decks. We don't usually, the same thing with EIRs. There's two main documents we utilize in our department. But
so if
we
you
had
feel
something
like
that truly was, we would.
Right. If it sort of falls into one of the predefined categorical exemptions, you pretty much always go with that if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, the caveat to that is we have the VMP that we can use, we have the Cal VTP we can use, and then of course most everybody, understandably so, wants to throw everything under the categorical exemption of minor alteration. So then but if there is anything on site that falls within those 6 exceptions that they end up having to mitigate, that's when we start to push over to the VMP or the VTP side, or they have to take that piece of that project out of the NOE, because we won't approve an NOE at our level with the state within CAL FIRE if we have any deferred protection language in it or any mitigation language. The exemption is clearly there's nothing there, and our project will not have an impact because nothing's there. That's how we roll with it.
It seems like there's so many special status species that it's hard for me to imagine. I don't know. Thanks for taking my questions.
No problem.
Do you want Alice and me to answer? I can answer Bill and Francis and Tracy's questions really quickly, or do you want to wait until after Dan's presentation for me to touch on those?
It could be great to answer them now just while it's fresh in people's minds.
Okay. So Bill, you're asking, is there only one location where you need to submit your notice for public review? So it depends on what your agency's policy is. So for the state, we only file with the state clearinghouse. And then we're, because of the 819 that Jonathan had talked about, we are required now to post to our public notices webpage. So for us, there's two locations. You, depending on whether or not your agency requires it, you could file with the county clerk, who would then post with the clearinghouse or post on their notices page. But you would also have to be required to post it on your public notices page. So that's a messy answer to your is there only one location for your notice of public review? And I'm presuming that's for your like a notice of exemption, because for a mitigated neg deck or EIR, you do have to also post to either when you're doing your public review to the actual project location or physical locations around, or provide notices to landowners adjacent to the project. So for Francis, and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, do statutory exemptions require filing of notice of exemption subject to the same legal challenge timeline? And that's in relationship, because I answered a question on is there a public review timeline waiting period for an NOE? And there's no public review for an NOE, but the 35 and 180 days that Jonathan was mentioning is just for legal challenges to the agency's decision to utilize the exemption. And so it's 35 days if you post your notice of exemption, or 180 days if you don't. So statutory exemptions, the ministerial require posting through the NOE, and the CEQA guidelines actually has, it's called Appendix E, and there's an example of the notice of exemption, and one of the categories in there is the ministerial. We don't usually utilize it because when we use the statutory, it's emergencies. So for us, it's when we go out and we're fighting wildfires. The question from Tracy, is there a difference in scale you use for categorical exemptions versus an initial study for the mitigated neg deck? So for our department and our policies, we utilize that Appendix G, which is very similar to the initial study. It's a modified version of it, but essentially it is like we're almost performing a initial study so that we know we are doing our due diligence when utilizing the categorical exemptions. Lucas's question is incredibly long, so I'm going to read it, and then we can, if you don't mind, Lucas, we'll come back to it after Dan's presentation.
Yeah, I just want to touch on is there a difference in scale? I also assume maybe the question is related to like acres. How big is the project? And I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, but I always, one of the things is I get the question, well, I have a 5-acre fuel reduction project, so that's obviously an NOE because of the size. I don't necessarily agree with that, simply for the fact that you don't know what's on site. You could have a burial site, you could have a bald eagle, you could have some significant plants, you could have a whole bunch of environmentally sensitive stuff on that 5 acres, and you could have a 1,000-acre project that absolutely has nothing that would actually fall within the NOE. So project size doesn't necessarily dictate whether or not you fall within the exemption world with the categorical exemptions. It really depends on what you find on site to make sure you don't have one of those 6 exceptions to the exemptions on site. And we'll kind of talk about in my next presentation how you get to that point. The last thing is from our point of view in the department, if you send me a 10,000-acre NOE, you have to they have to explain to me how they categorically, without any question, know 100% that that project has no sensitive species and nothing that they would affect. And that's hard to do on 10,000 acres because you have to be able to convince us that you can meet that burden of proof. So size doesn't necessarily play a role based off the species that may be present or the resources that are there. However, even if you had no resources, you still have to be able to prove that and convince us, at least under our policy, that the due diligence was done. Hopefully that maybe answers your question. And then if there's no other immediate questions, I'm going to go ahead and get my stuff prepared to share. So technically challenged here. Sienna may have to run in from her other office. See if I can do this. Is it going to work? Someone let me know if you can see my presentation.
Looks great.
Okay. Shannon peeked in on me, so we're good to go, I think. So, I mean, are we ready to continue, or is there maybe a couple more questions before I get into this part of it? Okay.
Go ahead and dig in. Yeah.
Okay, dig in. So what I want to touch on, Jonathan did a great job of letting you know what CEQA was about and the process of how to follow that flow chart. Like I said, my experience comes from extensive force practice, where we, since '92, I've been working in the force practice world, where everything is scripted. The regulations in the rule book is completely scripted, and it tells us what the review process is. It tells us essentially it tells us what our best management practices are. CEQA doesn't do any of that. CEQA doesn't tell you what your best management practices are. Force practice rules don't apply to our CEQA projects outside of timberland, although people will use those as maybe practices they're using, but they're not CEQA best management practices. You come up with your own. So what I found when I was started this job is I had to learn all this in a different light, because CEQA doesn't provide that guideline or that process that's involved. Like many of you, and this is where I like to be actually in a room where I can see people. I always like to know how many people are familiar with doing work under the Force Practice Act, just to get a sense of kind of knowledge bases where we're at. The big thing with the force practice world and with the CEQA world is we still have to do some kind of analysis. CEQA not providing a known analysis process. It just says you have to analyze certain elements to your project, and that these 6 exceptions don't apply to your exemptions. So in many times what I come across here is someone will call me up and go, "Oh, I submitted the grant and I want to get my CEQA approved under an NOE." I'm like, okay, but have you done any analysis at all, a preliminary analysis, if you want to call it that, or a scoping, or any kind of review of your project? Have you done any of that stuff to determine if you can even qualify under an NOE? One of the biggest mistakes I think people make is we all assume, me included, that our projects should fall under a notice of exemption because we feel like the work we're doing is more of an improvement than something that would be destructive or environmentally having environmental damage, because we're doing a positive thing. Under the CEQA world and under at least CAL FIRE policy with the lead agencies, that's a dangerous assumption to make. So we're going to kind of dive into that in project development and analysis for fuels reduction. All right, let's see if I can get my slides to move here. Hold on. Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to discuss how to develop a project and the things to consider for project impact analysis. Again, you can claim your project is not going to have a significant effect, and you can go to work without the filing, like Jonathan pointed out. And then the public has 180 days. From a resource professional standpoint, that wouldn't be the path I would go. I always want to make sure that I have some kind of information available on hand. And so therefore, as I develop my project, I'm taking certain things into consideration. Again, the main thing being early on, everybody's trying to determine You made the determination that you're a public agency. You've made the determination that your project is a project. Now you got to make the determination, is it an exemption or is it exempt from any further CEQA analysis? That's going to require some level of analysis to make sure you're not within those 6 exceptions to the NOE. And this is where CEQA doesn't necessarily tell you how to make that determination. So that's where we're going to go with this presentation. So initial project development. How do you determine where and when a project is needed? More than likely, you're in a resource conservation district, or you're in the you're one of the CAL FIRE units, and we know, hey, we really need to get this road opened up because fires are going to be in this area eventually, and we need to have good ingress and egress. The units have unit fire plans, and they identify those areas early on. They may or may not have a plan to get to them within the next, year or two, but they have a plan. I'm assuming most of the resource conservation districts, listening to constituents in the counties, also have an idea of where areas need to be addressed. So that's someone's going to make that determination of when a project's needed. And then once it's determined, have you done a site visit? Do you even know what it looks like? Do you have a good project description? Do you know the size? Do you know what kind of fuels you're going to be treating and what the plan is for in there, or even how you're going to plan on removing those fuels? And then who's going to make the determination of when the project is moving forward? So where's your timeline on that? And does the project even seem feasible? I mean, we do look at the feasibility of a project. This is the who, what, whens, and wheres. Is it something that that is going to work for as planned? So we have project development, and it's important to get good project development. So there's 4 things you want to consider during project development. You want to identify boundaries. The project development identifies the boundaries and necessary information with enough detail so all potential impacts can be identified. And again, with enough detail. So this is the whole of the project that Jonathan touched on during his CEQA presentation. It's not just burning, it's all associated work with burning. So hand line construction, dozer line construction, maybe it's just an engine with a wet line. Is there any pre-treatment activities that are going to take place? Hand cutting with a chainsaw and scattering and lopping to allow burning. Will a dozer be used with a ball and chain? Or will 2 dozers be used just to chain, or will it be used to crush? It's the whole of the project, everything that is involved. Most of the projects I get with the scoping information that goes to the other agencies, or with the analysis requesting collaboration with the other agencies, we'll say we're going to do a broadcast burn. When the project comes to me, now they've talked about in the project, we're going to crush brush. We're going to put in a blade wide dozer line. We're going to put some hand lines over here. We're going to open up a road here. We're going to have a stream crossing here. And you're like, well, wait a minute, this wasn't even anywhere in that scoping letter. So if we're collaborating with another agency, we haven't given them enough information to understand the whole of the project. And therefore, when it comes to my shop, I have to now send it back and say, hey, you need to talk with the other agencies and give them the bigger picture. What is everything, enough of the detail so that environmental impacts can be evaluated from the whole of the project. Okay, a good project development is necessary to determine the appropriate CEQA document based on site-specific projects, implementation, and actions. And we kind of touched on that. You're trying to ultimately figure out, can you use the categorical exemption, which we use most commonly as the minor alteration in landscape. So you need to know, do you have sensitive habitats or species or action or environmental resources that are in the area that your project could affect? If you're under an exception, you can't do the NOE unless you cut that portion of the project out. So it helps determine your CEQA. And that's what the whole purpose behind this process is to start not an initial study, but to start a process to make a determination that eventually could lead further into your initial study. Let's see here. Will you help? Yeah, my computer's down the way. Oops. Did I lose everybody there? Someone let me know.
You're still here.
Okay. A good project development will help you better communicate your project details to other agencies and the public. Again, if you're collaborating and you want to know everything about your project, you're going to have to give them good project descriptions and details. Again, the project as a whole. And it allows the project manager to determine if a project can be designed to avoid significant impacts or develop mitigation measures to avoid. Again, that's the determination between I can avoid, I can go the NOE route. I'm going to have do mitigation measures. So I might be looking at a mitigated negative deck, or I can be looking at doing a Cal VTP. So when does the project development start? Well, it starts the moment there's a plan to establish a fuels reduction project. Someone came to you from the community. They said, hey, you know, we've got 5 miles of road. We've got 35 houses down at the end of this road, and it's really overgrown. We'd like you to consider, you know, doing some fuels treatment projects along that road for ingress and egress. Your scoping is now started at that point. You have a location and you have a plan. Is it a complete plan? Probably not. Is it a complete location? Probably not. This is where you now have to get out there and start to make your determinations, get on the ground. But that's when your scoping starts, as soon as something's presented to you. And now you're going to actually go out and look and see if it's feasible. When does the CEQA process start? CEQA process starts by determining whether the activity meets the CEQA definition of a project. So you could go out there and it turns out it's, you know, miles of people's yards and it's all grass and it's just going to need to be mowed. Is it even a feasible project? Is it a project under CEQA? Is you going to use state funding to do that? Is there anybody as a public agency, do you have to, your discretion, have you decided it's a project? Okay, considerations for project development. Again, the big one, the number one, always consider the project as a whole. Take into consideration all elements of that project when you're going to be there. In most cases, the projects have many levels of potential impact before you get to the specific treatment or final outcome. Again, the burn example. Yes, we're going to broadcast burn. We determined that the fire, low intensity, is not going to have impact on any resources that are there. But if you haven't brought up the fact that you're going to put dozer line in there and take it down to bare mineral soil, then you haven't done the whole of the action. And that has a different level of impact. And if you're collaborating with responsible agencies, they're not aware that that's going to occur. When it hits my shop, from a review standpoint with our department or with our staff, or if we're acting as a lead, we're going to kick it back to make sure those agencies are made aware of those. And then consider everything you may want to do, even if you may not have funding for it. So this goes into, there's some slide that gets into that, but we all want to get fuels reduction done today on 50 feet either side of a road for 5 miles. And when we're done, it looks great and everybody's happy. And we did that with a masticator, and we did that with burning, and we did that with chainsaws and a chipper. But 5 years down the road, 3 years down the road, you're going to want to maintain that. So when you're looking at your projects, think about farther down the road and include other treatment types that might include, let's say, herbicides or herbivarian type treatments. If it's not initially listed in the NOE, you can't go back and do maintenance for those things. You only can use the treatments that you initially put into your project. So consider everything and look farther down the road for these projects. And then one of the things I've been trying to talk with our units about, because we get so many units have a variety of ways of doing things. I've been encouraging them to develop a questionnaire that might help them provide a good guide through the process. In other words, what I want them to do, you guys can still see my PowerPoint, right?
Yes, but it hasn't progressed since importance of good project development.
Okay, sorry about that. All of a sudden my screens just flopped around on me. So so developing a good questionnaire, and it can be, we'll get into some of the questions as we go through the rest of this PowerPoint, but really it's kind of developing a questionnaire for project development, so that someone that's going out and looking at a project, you can go, hey, So take these things into consideration. Maybe it's a member of the public that you can ask that comes to you with a project, and the questionnaire kind of gives them things to consider and look at. Or it's a staff member that can go out and do a good initial look at the project to see if it's feasible. And we'll get into some of those ideas of what the questionnaire has. So when collecting the project information, cover the who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? What does the project entail and how will it happen? When you're out there looking to see if it's feasible, is 50 feet either side of the road feasible, or is it going to be better based off the vegetation type to do 100 feet either side of the road? Maybe you don't know. So your scoping area, you want to start considering when you're drawing your maps, maybe a larger scoping area to start include more area in there. Because if you start your scoping maps at only 50 feet, then that's as far as you can go. So when you're scoping, take your area and get a little bit bigger in your thought. Why is this project important? Jot those notes down. Again, this is a good question for the questionnaire. Why is it important? Why do you feel that this project's needed? Again, where are the project boundaries? Is it at 50 feet? Okay, that's fine. That's what the person that brought you the project decided. But in your feasibility analysis, when you're out there looking at the area from a landscape level and from the vegetation level, is 50 feet enough? Maybe it does need to go bigger. It's okay to go bigger. At least scope for bigger and plan for bigger, right? When will the project happen? Is there specific timeframes that you have to that you need to work within, right? For most grants, you know, that for the fire prevention grants, we know you have a year to get CEQA, or then there's the fear that the money will disappear. The fact is the money won't. We're going to help you get the CEQA coverage, but we know you have a year, right? That's why everybody pushes for the NOE, but it's not necessary to always try to get it done with an NOE. Sometimes, oh, they're not advancing? Something happened to my screen. Hold on, technical difficulties, I apologize. Kind of disappeared. Oh, there she goes. Shannon fixed me. Sorry, I did not know my slides weren't advancing. I apologize. Okay. So this is why the questionnaire is important to follow along or to kind of put together. And it can be it doesn't have to be what I suggest. All your counties, you all have very specific, maybe socio or political or economic issues that you're dealing with. And so there could be questions that I haven't even considered. But when you're doing a questionnaire, the whole idea is to try to get the project as a whole. And then including who's going to end up doing that work. Let's see if I can advance my slide. Okay, so here's some of the questions that we start asking. What is the purpose of the project? Is this just for ingress or egress? That helps you determine your project boundaries. It's imperative you understand your boundaries of your project so that you can get a good scoping area. My biggest issue I have, even with our CAL FIRE staff, is, well, they'll put a boundary, they'll use a landowner's ownership, and then they want to do prescribed fire, but the ownership boundaries are on 60% slopes. There's no way they're going to be able to stop a fire from progressing past the boundary on that project. So from a landscape level, the project's not really feasible. They need to either use a road that's farther that may be off of the property or a ridge line that's off of the property. So you want to look at the whole project as that whole, and you want to include scoping should be bigger than your project area to account for some of these variations in the landscape level and vegetation makeup. Is it a fuel break or a shaded fuel break? Is it within a wildland urban interface or area? These are all important questions that help you determine feasibility and the size of your project. Is there wildlife and rangeland habitat improvement? Are you going to be doing that? Some of our projects, that may be an unintended consequence, but it's certainly worth bringing up, or maybe it's the primary focus. and what vegetation is expected to be treated. And that's during the project or after the project, like into the maintenance thing. Are we just dealing with 10-inch fuels or ladder fuels that are less than 10 inches and brushes and grass? Or will we be removing any of the overstory trees? And if we are they dead or dying? Are dead or living? And then how will these trees be treated? Understand that when we're in a forested environment, you know, the NOEs under CEQA are not for commercial purposes or for logging. So trees that are removed that are larger, if they're live trees, we're going to ask the question, what are you going to do with those? Are they going to a mill? Because if they're going to the mill, we have a different path you'll need to take, right? And I don't want to get into that now. Most often people are just taking, if you're going to take larger trees over 10 inches, that would be during our, when we read it, it looked like commercial type size species. People just say they're going to lop, buck them and leave them and, remove all the debris, or they're just going to chip them or masticate them on site. So again, I go back to this scoping and do you have a map of the project area? Again, this mapping is super important when we look at scoping for our project. Is it just a map of the ownership, or does it include the landscape level features needed to actually complete the project? Is it feasible, right? If I've got property lines on slopes over 60% and they're mid slope, it does not appear feasible to stop fire on a broadcast burn at that level. But there might be a road 300 feet up the hill on somebody else's property that the battalion chief or the burn boss wants to use. So when you're looking at these projects, we all focus in, and I've done it myself, on the exact project area. But when you're looking at your maps for your scoping, consider outside that box at a landscape level to make your project, feasible. So my two examples are your road projects and your ownership projects. How far from the road edge is the project plan? What is the length and the miles of the road to be treated? This helps us calculate how many acres are going to be treated. What is the vegetation to be treated? Are we just talking about a weed eater going in there and cutting down grass? Or because maybe it's an old field project that only grass has come back up in and no one knows where the CEQA document is for that particular project anymore? Or is it, chamise and manzanita that's 10 feet tall and we need to cut it back, farther than maybe 50 feet along the road because of the, the fire intensity in that. So the vegetation is very important to take into consideration in the feasibility. And then what is the method of treatment and how will it be applied? This is very, very important when it comes to your analysis because it's the project as a whole. You don't, every treatment method is viewed as having its own level of environmental effect, let's say. So piling and burning, well, a lot of people think that's less impactive, or a lot of people view that as more impactive, let's say, than broadcast burning because you're increasing burn intensity at a single spot and you don't know subsurface what's there, right? Mastication from an excavator with a masticating head on a stationary or on an existing road system, and it's just reaching in with the excavating head and doing mastication is considered less impactive than a skid steer with a masticator head where it's actually occupying the ground surface. We all have seen projects. We all have our different views of how these treatment methods are impactive to the soil and to the ground around us. But from a CEQA standpoint, those projects are viewed, or those treatment methods are viewed a little bit differently in terms of their impacts, especially within the archaeological world. So describing your treatment method and how it's going to be applied, or the implementation of that treatment method, is very important to do, included in your scoping letters for the other agencies. And then the ownership projects. What are the landowner's objectives? Are there roads outside the ownership that need to be used to complete the project? And treatments be completed. Oh, sorry about that. My slide just changed over on me. So I just want to get into the map thing just one last time here. When you're looking at your project, consider the landscape level of the project, whether or not you can get onto someone's ownership to actually do the physical on the ground analysis is not the important part in the initial scoping that you're going to do for your project. So look at it at a landscape level. This again takes into the feasibility of your project. Sometimes, you know, roadside projects at 20 feet either side, you get out there and you look at the trees that are overhanging the road, and the kind, you know, the 10-foot tall or 15-foot tall manzanita and chamise that's there. Is 20 feet really feasible? Are you actually going to achieve anything by doing only 20 feet? Those are the kind of things you want to do. So don't just automatically go into your computer, draw a 20-foot either side of the road polygon, and then send that out to other agencies for collaboration, other responsible agencies. Actually go out on the ground to make sure that's even feasible or practical or going to do any good. Because you will find probably that the project should go wider. A lot of people go, well, I'm not gonna go that far out because I don't know that all the landowners will let me onto their property to continue the analysis, looking for plants or looking for arc sites. Initially, on the onset of the project, you're just submitting a map to the other agencies that is asking them to take this whole area into consideration. So plan for it to be bigger. Again, if you look at ownerships, look at that landscape level to make sure that you can actually do what the proposal to do is, right? So look at your initial scoping letters if you're sending them out with your maps to consider the landscape level. I'm not talking give me a whole county or 10,000 acres for, you know, a 200 acre project, but look at the immediate landscape level features that are there, what I call control points, the ridges, the water courses, the existing roads. Can your project fit and give me and identify that area as the scoping area for those other agencies? And then you can show where you think your project's going to occur, but you're asking them to look at the areas outside so that you can get the opportunity to expand if necessary. So what types of treatments are you considering? And again, I touched on this. Is it prescribed burning? Is it mastication, pollen burning, herbicides, herbivory, or chipping? Again, the herbivory and the herbicides is super important because I want you to always remember project as a whole, and that includes maintenance. So always remember you want to consider maintenance farther down the road. So these are some of the questions that can be asked of landowners that are proposing projects to you, or that staff need to consider in the initial development of the project. Is line construction? We talked about this. Is line constructed needed? If yes, will it be hand or equipment? Are any pre-treatment activities expected? If yes, state how. Ball and chain, crushing, hand cutting. Will prescribed burning or pile burning occur within a watercourse buffer zone? If no, what is the buffer zone distance? Again, I want to remind everyone, we're not subject to the forest practice rules. So your buffer zone distances don't have to follow 916.4, the 3, 4, and 5 of the forest practice rules. You can use a buffer distance that's appropriate for the protection of the environmental resources that you have on site, and that is necessary to complete your project. So there's no, in my opinion, there's no reason to handcuff yourself with a larger distance, let's say 100 feet, when we're not falling timber or using skid trails or disturbing soil to the level of a logging operation. So you might be able to do it a little bit shorter, and that allows your burning to occur. One of the questions that Fish and Game has always had, and I've had lots of conversations with them on, is, well, we don't want you to burn that much in the WLPZ because they'll fall back to forest practice language. I'm not worried about a WLPZ. I'm just worried about a buffer. And then it's a low intensity fire that under prescription will burn less than, let's say, 75%. It'll only burn 25% of the upper end of a buffer zone because the fire it won't even be in prescription in those high humidity areas. Just explaining something like that in a letter will get their attention and make them understand what your project's doing. They view fire as wildland fire, not as prescribed fire. They view mastication as skid trails like logging, not as what we see and know as mastication. So there's an education piece that goes into these descriptions. Mastication, is it ground-based, such as a track chipper, or the ground-based such as a skid steer, or chipping with a track chipper? Will mastication occur from existing road with an excavator? Again, it's viewed completely different in terms of its significant impacts. Will there be any ground-based disturbance with the masticator, or do you know that you're going to use a subsoiling bar on the masticator that's going to stop all mastication 6 inches above the ground? If you know that, state that. That gives them the idea, especially from the archaeological side, that we're not going to be getting into the soil and disturbing any of significant or resources that might be below the surface. And then chipping, is it ground-based chipper or is it a track chipper? Or will it be just hand cut and pulled and dragged to a chipper? All good things to point out when you're trying to get other responsible agencies' input from a project. These are all the things that they would like to know. So when will the project happen? Is there a mandatory implementation date? For the grant projects, usually it's, I got to get this done within a year so we can get started because there's an expiration date of the grant. So that's just something as you're planning your project, you need to look into. Also understand when you're preparing your grants, if you already have a lot of the grants I've read, they give us pretty much a pretty good project description. Most of this may have already been done through your grant project. And then if you get into the, that biological and archaeological stuff early on, you're going to know whether or not you fall within one of the exceptions for the NOE. So then you'll know comfortably whether or not an NOE will apply. What's the time frame for environmental review? So I find this one very interesting because I'm the CEQA reviewer for the CAL FIRE in the northern region. So everybody wants to know how long it's going to take for me to do the environmental review of the document, the review of the document. Really, the review's on you. It's your analysis, your preliminary analysis, or your scoping of your area, and taking all these factors into consideration, and knowing where to get to these resources to start making determinations. You're practically starting an initial study, just to determine if you fall within the exemption category. And then what are the target seasons to complete the work? So obviously burning, we try to look at spring or fall, right? Units that are higher elevation might have a little bit different timing because of snow melt. So they might be working in the fall as much as they can, but then they're going to try it right after snow melt. They know, snow melt and burn conditions are good in May. So they might say May, June, right? And then what kind of equipment work when soils are dry, those kind of things. You're not going to be out there on the ground-based equipment if it's raining, when soils are saturated. So get all this stuff and understand, in that initial project development, these are all questions you want to try to answer. And I touched on this one, is maintenance anticipated? Look to the future of what you want to do. I get a lot of calls. Hey, we completed our NOE. It's been 3 years now, and now all the grasses are coming back in and we want to put some goats in there. Can we go ahead and do that under the NOE? And I'm like, well, let's take a look at the NOE. So I go to the state clearinghouse, and nowhere in the NOE that was filed did it say that there was going to be herbivore treatments. So my answer to that question is no, you can't use the goats, even though it's probably logical and it's probably practical, but it wasn't initially discussed in your NOE. So look forward and remember, project as a whole, all work that's going to be done and incidental there too. Jonathan showed you this slide, so I won't get into it, but again, you're using a scoping process or a preliminary analysis of your project area just to determine if it's feasible, whether it's within those six exception areas of the NOE, so that you can make that determination of whether or not you can follow the NOE and then move forward. And again, just because you have something doesn't preclude you from the NOE. You just may have to design around it, which means there's going to be an area that won't be treated. That is perfectly acceptable to do. However, always analyze whether or not that makes that project even feasible. It could take it from the feasible. And honestly, doing the initial study for a mitigated negative deck or or looking at doing the Cal BTP, I know they look daunting, but in my opinion, having stuff on site and mitigating for it and doing a project as its whole is way better than trying to do little fractions of it just to get it to fit under an NOE, because then you're missing pieces that may make the project, not feasible. So what do we analyze in our impacts? For fuels reduction, it's kind of we have a lot of resources that we can use for that. So we start with Appendix G. That's the environmental checklist. And then that the CEQA comes up with is, so those are the elements that CEQA suggests that you take a look at the impact your project. So then you use the California Natural Data Diversity Database. This helps you know if there's any presence or absence for species of special concern, rare, threatened, or endangered. And then you look at that, and that's just a presence or absence analysis. So you might see that there's nothing within your project scoping area, but then you look at the habitat elements, and do those habitat elements exist within your project? And if they do, how are you going to make sure that you're not going to have an impact? You can look at the Soil Diversities Index, the CMPS list, which will actually come up on your CNDDB. Is it in a 303 impaired water body? And then you have your tribal resources and archaeological aspects of things that you want to look at. These are all important to scope for to do in your preliminary analysis, even if you're trying to go the NOE route, simply for the fact that all those kind of tell you whether or not you fall within one of those 6 exception areas to the exemption. So if I have a tribal resource under the NOE, I'm going to design my project around it. I'm not going to operate in there. Or I really need to operate in there because it's critical to the project. So now you're going to come up with mitigation and look at the VTP process or the MND process. Getting to the end. So here's the Appendix G elements that are considered: aesthetics, agricultural, forest, air quality, energy, geology, and soils. Here's one that really doesn't fall within most of our fuels reduction projects, would be like energy or land use planning. We're not changing anything. We're not building, road and infrastructure and condominiums or apartment complexes where land use planning is going to change. We're just removing vegetation. We're going to not really affect utilities or service systems. We might have an impact on our recreation or transportation and traffic, but that's just simple to address. Roadside projects are classic for that. You're going to work with the county to close one lane of road so that you can use the excavator with a masticating head from the edge of the road. That's all. You're just pointing that out, and that's not going to have an impact based off the county planning and what they have going on, right? Noise is easy because noise just during normal business hours. So this is all stuff you don't necessarily have to write down, but these are the kind of things that in your due diligence, in your determination for the NOE and your scoping, this is what you want to take into consideration. And then down to our last slide. It's important to understand that policies and procedures can vary significantly between lead agencies for project development and analysis. What our department does is not necessarily what Fish and Game does, or what water quality does, or what state parks does. The CEQA wants us to analyze for public benefit that the government's not going to have an effect on natural resources. It doesn't tell us how to do that. And every lead agency has their own process. So one of the things that really kind of drove this message home to me was I had a resource conservation district. They wrote their they wrote a Cal VTP. So then their question to me was, and they wrote it on their own through the Board of Forestry's process, which Shannon will get into. CAL FIRE was not acting as the lead agency on this project at all. So they wanted to know who to send it to for review. Well, nowhere in CEQA or in the EIR does it say that there's a review process. It talks about, under the SPRs that Shannon will get into, it talks about some posting requirements, but it doesn't talk about a review process. So I said, well, you wrote it. You're acting as the lead agency, as the RCD. You get to review it and approve it. And he goes, I'm the only employee. And I'm like, well, do you like what you did? That's his, I mean, that's as the lead agency, did he meet the burden of proof? And that's the review process. That's where it sits with him. Hopefully he reached out to the other regulatory agencies and all those kind of entities that have responsible, that can be responsible agencies to get verification and those kind of things. And we discussed that, and he did. But that's where it really kind of drove the process home to me, is that there is no regulatory process that's codified that says, like we do with timber harvest plans, that you send your document for review. It's all based off your policies and procedures. But you have to do this preliminary analysis to get started at any level of your project. And this is the kind of information that I've been trying to have the units understand for their own projects, as well as to spread the word to the grantees. So with that, I want to end with, obviously, I'm always good with taking phone calls and answering questions. But with our department, it is also very important that you contact the unit first and work through them. And that, there's most everybody I think is in the Lake Napa unit. So there's a list of the names there. There's the Assistant Chief, Tom Connect, and then Forester One, Tim Holiday, and then the environmental scientist, Rochelle Freimeyer. They are the contacts. If they don't know the question, they will get a hold of me. Tim and I have talked extensively on trying to streamline and shore up the process as we go through, especially if you're using CAL FIRE as the lead agency. And then just try to provide input and insight to people when they want to take on the lead agency role themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and end with that as my slide, and then hopefully we'll figure out how to stop sharing. I think I stopped sharing there. So I don't know where we want to go next, but I don't have the agenda up because my slides were up. But if there's any questions, I'm willing to take some questions as well. See if I can get the chat. Let's see.
Just scrolling through the chat, it looks like Catherine had asked a question about whether it's necessary to survey for rare plants or nesting birds, particularly for spring burns or mastication. And Shannon answered that we do based on the CNDDB results or the ecoregions in the CalVTP. So I just wanted to make sure folks saw that. I think there were. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, we oftentimes look at our projects because we know the actual on the ground effect as not having an effect regardless if something's there. But that is dangerous to do from a resource professional standpoint. And we're not trying to hide anything from the public. So realistically, I mean, looking for these things and having an understanding of what's in our project is in everybody's best interest, because anecdotally, we all feel that our projects don't have impacts, and we feel like we should be able to explain that to people that they're for the greater good and that we don't have an impact. Unfortunately, the public doesn't have the background that we have and an understanding. So doing the surveys and knowing what's there and understanding how our project interacts with those resources gives us information that's qualitative and quantitative that we can actually demonstrate that these kinds of projects are kind of at a low level and they don't have that significant impact, rather than just say, well, we just know it doesn't. So, take it all into consideration and develop yourself a good justification, and even going back and taking a look and monitoring and showing that you're not having the effects. You're probably going to actually be able to go back on these projects and go, look at all the stuff that's now there that wasn't there before. And that happens quite often with plants. We find that most of them are not there because of the lack of disturbance rather than because of disturbance. So it's always a good idea to take all this into consideration.
Thanks, Dan. It looks like there were a couple other questions, but I think Shannon will be touching on these in her portion of the presentation, so we can probably save those. And okay. I know we're running a little short on time, but if anyone else has any other questions you want to ask briefly now, I think we could take a couple minutes.
Yeah, or if you want to give people a few minutes for a break, it's either or. I can talk fast and catch us up.
I'm sure everyone would appreciate just a few minutes for a break if needed. Should we maybe come back and, I don't know, what sounds good to you, Shannon, based on your timing?
Just to make it easy for everyone, how about 11:20? So it's about, what is that, 7 minutes?
Good, thank you.
Okay, it's 11:20, so I'm going to just get things started. So I'm going to go over the California Vegetation Treatment Program, or also known as the CalVTP. I'm hoping that most of you know about this program already. It's been out since 2020, but I know there's still a lot of questions in regards to it. So I will hopefully get my slideshow up and running here. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my slides now. And I can't see the
It's
chats.
loading. Like it
Okay.
looks like a black screen on my end. Usually it loads by now. Maybe try Xing out and trying again. I see your cursor. There we go.
Oh, is it presenting now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay. All right. So again, California Vegetation Treatment Program. This is the CalVTP. And now I just have to make sure I'm on the right one to progress to the next slides. Love technology. Okay, so the CalVTP was prepared by the Board of Forestry and can be used by everyone. It's not a document that is specific to the board or CAL FIRE, like our chaparral management plan, also known as our VMP. So it was evaluated treating up to 250,000 acres per year, and it focuses on 3 different treatment types. So that's the wildland urban interface, fuel breaks, and ecological restoration. And there are 5 different treatment activities within that. There's prescribed fire, which is broken down into pile burning and broadcast burning, mechanical, manual, herbivory, and herbicide treatments. So there are 5 main objectives within the CalVTP. Bear with me because I'm going to read off of these next 2 slides word for word. So the main objectives are to serve as the vegetation management component of the state's range of actions underway to reduce risks to life, property, and natural resources by managing the amount and continuity of hazardous vegetative fuels that promote wildland fire, consistent with California's 2018 Strategic Fire Plan. 2, substantially increase the pace and scale of vegetation treatments to contribute to achieving a statewide total of at least 500,000 acres per year on non-federal lands, consistent with the governor's executive order, which results in the CalVTP target of up to 500,000 acres per year after considering other types and areas of vegetation treatments. To increase the use of prescribed burning as the vegetation treatment tool, consistent with the provisions of Senate Bill 1260, and to contribute to meeting California's greenhouse gas emission goals by managing forests and other natural and working lands as a net carbon sink consistent with the California Forest Carbon Plan, California 2017 Climate Change Scoping Plan, Fire on the Mountain, Rethinking Forest Management in the Sierra Nevadas, and the California 2030 Natural and Working Lands Climate Change Implementation Plan. And finally, to improve ecosystem health and fire-adapted habitats by safely mimicking the effects of a natural fire regime, considering historic fire return intervals, climate change, and land use constraints. So what does all that mean? So simplified, those 5 things are to serve as a management tool to reduce risks from high vegetation fuel loads, increase the pace and scale of fuel reduction to achieve the governor's goals of 500,000 acres per year, increase the use of prescribed burning as a vegetation treatment tool, and to manage forests and working lands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing large catastrophic wildfires, and to also improve the ecosystem health by increasing fire on the landscape. So again, who can utilize the CalVTP? So under the CalVTP, it's defined as the project proponent. So that is a state or local public agency providing funding for vegetation treatment or with land ownership and or management or other regulatory responsibilities in the treatable landscape. And then that's just a really short list of who this could be. Like, it could be CAL FIRE, cities, counties, special districts, universities, water agencies, conservancies, open space districts. There's actually a section 1.5 in the PEIR. Those are those 3 pages of a whole list of who can utilize this. And one of the questions that came up in the chat is a public agency. So a public agency is any state agency, board, or commission, any county, city, and public, any county, city and county, city, regional agency, public district, redevelopment agency, or other political subdivision. And that's defined from CEQA. And then a lead agency means the public agency. So again, that list that we just discussed, which has the principal responsibility for carrying out or approving a project which may have a significant effect upon the environment. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's for the public agency. So the CalVTP. So within the CalVTP, the programmatic EIR, there is what's called the treatable landscape. So the treatable landscape is based on primarily what we call the SRA, so that's the state responsibility area. And then within that, it included the vegetation types based on the California Wildlife Habitat Relationship, so that CWR system with wildfire risks. So that's 2 overlays, so the state responsibility area and then the CWHR. And then what they did is they excluded areas that had negligible wildfire risks. So, wet meadows, estuaries. And then they also excluded agricultural lands because it was primarily thought that those were within the local responsibility area, the LRA. That doesn't mean you can't do work in the LRA. It just means you have to do additional analysis to do work in both SRA and LRA. So of the 31 million acres of SRA, the CalVTP treatable landscape is 20.3 million acres. CalVTP does exclude federal responsibility areas. So any federal lands are excluded, and this document can't be utilized for that because it's NEPA versus CEQA. So here's a map of the treatable landscape. This is available in the programmatic EIR, and then there's also a viewer on the Board of Forestry's website that you can actually do a focus dive into and see this. So again, this is that 20.3 million acres. So in the treatable landscape, it broke it into 3 main fuel types, very basic. So you have grass, brush, and tree. So yellow is the grass, the red is the shrub or brush, and then there's the tree. So there's different treatment activities that can be utilized within the CalVTP. So there's 3 main different treatment types, and then inside each of those 3 different treatment types, there's the 5 different treatment activities. So the 3 different treatment types are the wildland-urban interface fuel reduction, so the WUI, and the main goal of this was so that it was the strategic removal of vegetation to prevent or slow the spread of non-wind-driven wildfire between structures and wildland and vice versa. Fuel breaks. So again, fuel breaks are in strategic locations, and they usually create a zone of vegetation removal and ongoing maintenance in a linear fashion that will help support our fire suppression efforts by giving the first responders a staging area access for fire control. And then there's ecological restoration. So ecological restoration focuses on restoring like ecosystem processes, conditions, and resiliency, but moderating uncharacteristic wildland fuel conditions and return it to historic vegetation composition, structure, and habitat values. So you have your main 3 different treatment types, and within that, there's the different activities that you can do. So there's prescribed burning, and again, this was separated into pile burning and broadcast burning. Mechanical treatment, so use of motorized equipment, manual treatment, hand tools, hand operated power tools, prescribed herbivory, and then herbicide use. So here is a map of the WUI treatment area. So this is just a map where they went and used spatial analysis to determine where these areas are. Just because they are on the map doesn't mean you can only utilize them here. You can utilize these 3 specific treatment areas anywhere within the treatable landscape. This was just a model that they used. So again, these are in and around those transition zones between the wildland and urban areas. And then here is a map of the fuel break treatment areas. And this is again similar where it was just a spatial analysis of it. So all those tiny little red dots are where they modeled doing fuel break treatments. But again, they don't have to be in those specific areas. And then the ecological restoration treatment areas. And these are similar to the WUI and fuel break. These were mainly areas outside of WUI, again, that have departed from their natural fire regime due to fire exclusion. So in the programmatic EIR, they have table 2-3, and what it does is it breaks down the 5 different treatment activities. It gives a description of what those are, and then examples of methods of application for that, so that you have an idea of what each one of those things are. So the other analysis that the CalVTP did was ecoregions. So the ecoregions are modeled within the treatable landscape, and they're based on the U.S. Forest Service ecological sections. Appendix Bio 3 in the CalVTP lists the potential species that could be within each one of these ecoregions. So they're very large. The tables are very long, but it gives you something else that you can look at to see what potential plant and animal species you have. Because as we know, and Dan stated before, the CNDDB is a presence only. It doesn't take into consideration things that may be there that haven't been found. So it just allows it so that you're doing a complete analysis on any potential impacts you would have. So here's an example, again, of the ecoregion. It's very, like I said, very small, but it breaks the tables down into, this one is table 1A, and so this is specific to the plant species, and then there'll be table 1B, which would be specific to animal species that occur within that ecoregion treatment area. So let's do a breakdown of the analysis within the PEIR. So the PEIR has what's called the standard project requirements. So I'm going to shorten that down to SPRs. So the SPRs will be incorporated into all proposed vegetation treatments under the CalVTP as a standard part of treatment design and implementation. And it's intended to avoid and minimize environmental impacts that are applicable to laws and regulations. And they're intended to be implemented and enforced the same way as you would mitigation measures. So this is why the CalVTP is a little bit more streamlined than, let's say, a mitigated negative declaration or an EAR is because it already has these standard project requirements and mitigation measures built into them for each impact analysis, so that you don't have to come up with them on your own like you would for those other environmental documents. So there's a total of 70 SPRs in the PEIR that need to be analyzed. Not all of them may apply to your specific project, but they all need to be evaluated. And as you can see, this goes through most of the impacts that you'll be looking at in Appendix G of the CEQA guidelines. So the next thing is the mitigation measures. So again, they all need to be looked at, but not all of them will apply. And these were specific to their impacts they're related to. So the very first one for aesthetics is called mitigation measure AES3, because that ties back specifically to impact 3 of aesthetics and visual resources. And this helps mitigate down the impact that was analyzed within the PEIR. And there's a total of 21 of them that have to be looked at within the VTP. So the project process. So Dan touched on project development in his presentation and scoping. And so for the Cal VTP, generally the project plan is, based on landowner objectives, and then taken into consideration the responses or concerns of other agencies. And then once you've gotten your project developed and those other considerations from the agencies, you put all of that information into what's called a project-specific analysis, and you discuss all of the applicable SPRs and mitigation measures. And there is a template available on the Board of Forestry's website that helps you walk through this process. And then once you have your project approved, there are certain standard project requirements per SPR Administrative 7 that require you to provide information to the Board of Forestry during that project development timeline. More specifically, so SPR Administrative 7 provides information to the public on a proposed, approved, and completed treatment projects for the Cal VTP. So prior to your project being approved, 15 days minimum, you have to provide information to the Board of Forestry on your project. So that would be a point on a map, what you anticipate your acreage is going to be, the different treatment types and activities. So again, there's the 3 different treatment types and 5 different treatment activities that you're proposing, and then the contact information for a representative of the project proponent. So whoever if the public has questions regarding the project, someone they can contact. This is not a public comment period. It is an opportunity for the public to gain a little bit of information about the project and then provide input. We kind of give our units it's best to answer their questions and provide them some information as you can, but it's not a formal public comment period. And then once your project has been approved, you need to provide the completed and signed project-specific analysis with the mitigation and monitoring reporting program to the Board of Forestry. And then you also need to provide them with a polygon of the project area showing them the extent of each treatment type. So again, not treatment activities, treatment type. So what area is going to be ecological restoration, fuel break, or WUI? These treatment types don't overlap. They can be adjacent to each other, but there's no overlap to them. Treatment activities can overlap because we understand that you might have to go in and do either manual or hand treatments in order to do prescribed burning before you can actually go in and do like an herbicide application to maintain it. And then once you've completed your project, you provide more information to the board. And that is GIS data that shows the treatment area, again, showing where you actually did those specific treatment types, not treatment activities, but treatment types in relation to what you had proposed. And then there's a post-project implementation report that has the size of the area that you treated. So, what you proposed versus what you actually treated, what treatment types you completed and what activities you completed, when you did it, and then a list of the SPRs and mitigation measures that you actually implemented. And if there was any reason you had to defer or change how you implemented a specific SPR mitigation measure, then you have to provide information on why in the report as well. So that was SPR 87. So now let's dive into the actual project-specific analysis. So the project-specific analysis is like everything that you gathered during the project development phase, and then you're putting it into this PSA. So it's going to have like, the contact information, where your project is, what treatments you did, what fuel types you worked in, a description of the project, if you consulted with any other agencies, the SPRs and mitigation measures that are implemented, all of that is within the project-specific analysis. And thankfully, the board has a template, an environmental checklist that is on their website that you can utilize to help make sure that you capture all of this information in there. So again, this is the first page. So it has the title of your project, who the project proponent is, where it is, your acres that you're anticipating to treat, a description of the project. This breaks it into initial and then maintenance treatments, so that you're providing information like this is everything that we're doing first. And then once you've completed your initial treatments, how you're going to maintain that. So it goes into your different treatment types. Again, so there's 3 of them. They can't overlap, but you can have multiple ones in your project area. And then the different treatment activities. They do ask for acres for those treatment activities. This is an older form, so it's missing acres next to prescribed pile burning, but that is also asked for an estimate of that. And then it goes into what fuel types you're treating and then how you're going to maintain your project, and again, what activities and areas you're going to use to maintain it. So this is the meat of the VTP. This is the project-specific analysis. So every impact that was analyzed within the PEIR is listed within this example checklist. So the first 2 columns that you see in here are the impacts that are based on the entire programmatic EIR, so that 20.3 million acres. So the first one here is aesthetic and visual resources. So there's 3 specific impacts that they looked at. And then they identified the impact significance in the programmatic EIR. And so there's definitions in here for the abbreviations. But so for the first one, they said that it was less than significant. And they give you the specific write-up for how they came to that analysis in the programmatic EIR, and it gives you the pages and where to look for it. So 3.2 is section 3.2 is specific to aesthetics, and then 16 through 19 are the pages. So then what you do as the project proponent, after you've gathered all of this information, you've done all your scoping, is now you look at your project specific impacts. So these are abbreviated impacts. So impact to AES1, would the project result in short-term substantial degradation of a scenic vista or visual character or quality of public views or damage to scenic resources in a state scenic highway from treatment activities? So based on that and looking at section 3.2, does that impact apply to your treatment project? So you would either say yes or not applicable. And then you would list which standard project requirements are applicable to the treatment project. So when you go in again to that section 3.2, it'll have a list of the SPRs that were analyzed to come to that less than significant determination. So you would list those there. And then you would list any mitigation measures applicable to the treatment project. So for that one, like we said before, the mitigation measures are specific to the impact that they're analyzing. So if there isn't a mitigation measure associated with impact AES1, then you would just leave that blank. But so for impact AES3, we know that there's a mitigation measure associated with it. So you would just say whether or not it was applicable. So then you need to identify the impact significance for the treatment project. So you would say whether or not it's less than significant with mitigation, substantial impact, or potential substantial impact based on your project-specific analysis. So then the next column is, would this be a substantially more severe significant impact than identified in the programmatic EAR? So theoretically, if your project is more substantial, so if you went from a less than significant to a potentially significant or substantial, then the next column is this impact within the scope of the PEIR? So you would either say yes or no, and then if it's more substantial, you would say yes or no. If your impact is not equal to or less than what was identified in the significance of the PEIR, you will have to do additional environmental analysis to make sure you're within the scope of the PEIR. And there's a flow chart that I'll go through at the very end of this to clear that up a little bit. So you would answer those 3 questions for the specific to aesthetics. And so each impact has a section like this that you would go through, and you just answer yes, no, and then which ones are applicable. And then you can provide supporting information at the bottom of this page to help with why you came to the conclusion that you did. And then the very last part of this is new aesthetic or visual resource impacts. So would the treatment result in other impacts to aesthetics and visual resources that are not evaluated in the Cal VT PEIR? So if you're within the scope, you would usually say that yes, so you'd say no, that there aren't any additional impacts. And if you say yes, then you would say how they are identified below. So after you get through the impact analysis, there's the standard project requirements. So these are the SPRs. Again, you have to look at all of them, but not all of them necessarily will apply. So this one is specific to the administrative, and you'll say whether or not that SPR is applicable to your specific treatment. And it breaks it down into the initial treatment and the maintenance treatment. When you're going to apply that SPR, so the timing of it, prior, during, after, who's going to implement that SPR, and then who's going to verify and monitor it, that it actually occurred to the specific standards. And then it does the same thing for the mitigation measures. And again, these are specific to the actual impact that was analyzed. So this one is for that aesthetics and visual that we had just looked at. And this one is specific for non-shaded fuel breaks. So if you are implementing a non-shaded fuel break for your project, then this mitigation measure would apply. If you are not, then you would just simply state no and then leave the rest of it blank. So this is that flow chart that I was telling you about. It's very similar to the CEQA flow chart that John kind of went through. So you have your plan project, you're going to submit your information to the Board of Forestry a minimum of 15 days prior to approval. So that can kind of happen wherever you are in the project analysis. You're going to design your project. You're going to implement SPRs to identify sensitive resources. You'll prepare your PSA, excuse me, and then you'll complete it. So if all of your impacts are within the scope of the PEIR, then you're going to go to, you're going to get project approved based on your agency's environmental approval processes. The board and CAL FIRE do not review and approve these. It's your agency's review processes. And then you'll provide your information to the board based on what you've determined. But if you have one impact that is new, that's at least less than significant, then you would prepare a notice of determination, a negative declaration. If you have one impact that's less than significant with mitigations, you'd have to prepare a mitigated neg deck. And then if you have something that has a substantially or more severe significant impact, then you would have to complete an EIR. And that's on top of doing the PSA. It would be specific for that impact, but it would have to be completed prior to approval. The majority of projects that we've seen have all fallen into the scope of the PEIR. For areas that are outside of the treatable landscape, so specific to local LRA, local responsibility area, you don't have to do a negative deck or mitigated neg deck or an EIR. You're doing an addendum to the PSA, because all of the treatments that you're proposing have already been analyzed within theoretically, all the treatments that you're proposing, as long as they've already been analyzed within the Cal VTP, are also within the same fuel types that the Cal VTP has analyzed. So just under each specific impact, you would just state that information in there. And there is a template on how to do that on the Board of Forestry's website as well. So again, once your project is approved, you'll provide that information to the Board of Forestry. Again, that's the signed and approved PSA with the mitigation and monitoring report, and then a polygon of that area. You would then implement your treatments and your SPRs and mitigation measures, complete your project, and then provide that information to the board. So again, like I said, there's the project implementation. So just make sure that prior to commencing your treatments, if there's any notifications that need to occur per like applicable SPRs and mitigation measures. So for broadcast burning, there are some requirements that you have to notify the County Board of Supervisors prior to conducting any burns. You'll want to make sure you do that. If there's posting requirements for areas in scenic highways that might have visual impacts, you need to make sure you do that first. You'll then conduct your project, and then you again would submit completed project reporting requirements to the Board of Forestry. So that seems like a lot of information. So how is this really streamlined? I want to just take a quick look back at the documents that John went through that could potentially be utilized. So again, we have your notice of exemption. So again, there's statutory exemptions. Usually these are ministerial projects that the county would approve, or there's the categorical exemptions, again, 33 classes, and then none of the 6 exclusions applied, precluding their use. If you have a project that fits under a notice of exemption, most likely you're going to utilize a notice of exemption because it's exempt from the CEQA requirements. And then you have the negative and mitigated negative declaration. So again, if the project is not exempt because it doesn't fall into those exemption classes, it doesn't, one of the exceptions applies, or you have to have a mitigation to prevent an impact, then you do the mitigated neg deck. So with the VTP, it already has those mitigation measures and SPRs built into it. So it's more of a streamlined process because you're not having to develop these on your own. And then you have the environmental impact reports. So usually these are larger projects that have a significant impact on the environment. The CalVTP is a form of an environmental impact report. So if you have a project that is that significant and that large, most likely it doesn't fall within those treatment methods activities that are already outlined in the VTP, and you would have to file an EIR. And again, here's a flow chart of that CEQA process. So pros and cons of the CalVTP. The pros, it has the mitigation measures already built into it. There's no public comment period. There's just the 15 days prior to approval, and that's just for the public to ask questions about the project. It's not specific to it's not an actual official public comment period. There's no CDFW filing fee. That was already handled when the initial PER was written. So you save about $3,000 versus trying to pay that when you file a neg deck, mitigated neg deck, or EIR. And CEQA compliance is already built into the process. So, for example, there's the water quality waste discharge waiver is already handled, and it's an automatic enrollment. And once you file your approved project, they'll send you a notification saying that your project has been enrolled, and that remember these are the terms that you agreed to, and that if they would like to come out, you know, that you're supposed to make it available for them. So cons of the VTP. There's already mitigations built into the PEIR. So a lot of, there's mitigations specific to times of when you can do mechanical treatments or herbivory. If there's a 30% chance of rain, you have to remove so goats or cows or whatever you're using for prescribed herbivory from the project area within 24 hours. If that's not something feasible because you're in an area that does a lot, that has a lot of rain, so maybe, you know, Humboldt, Del Norte counties, that might not be advantageous for you. It's only designed for the SRA, and so if you want to do work in the LRA, you would have to do an addendum. Again, it's relatively brief, and there are examples on the board's website of how to complete that. But it's not available for federal areas. So it's not a document where you could do cross-boundary work into a forest if you wanted to. And then you can't do timber harvest with the CalVTP as well, because that would fall under the forest practice rules. And then there's other, you know, compliance documents for that. So here is some links to the Board of Forestry website. It's a very, it's a more streamlined website than it was when it first came out, and it kind of breaks it down into the general CalVTP, and then you can look at specific documentation for the programmatic EIR. It breaks it down into the different impacts and sections, so it's easy to scroll through versus trying to print it out and flip through it. How to use it. There's examples of different PSAs on there. There's training videos and a PDF on how to walk through the different analyses and impacts, and if you're doing an addendum. And then there's also the implementation. So there's ArcGIS online maps where you can look at the treatable landscape layers. You can look at where proposed projects are, approved project polygons are, where the different eco regions lay out. It's a much friendlier website than it was before. And that's the Cal VTP in 38 minutes. So I'm sure there are questions on that. Anyone? Do I still have you with me?
I have a question.
Okay.
This is Catherine from Solano RCD again, and I'm just kind of curious at the nuts and bolts of this. It sort of sounds like this Cal VTP is sort of it assists us because it's sort of laying the framework of what our approach should be. And so I think it is helpful. But I'm just curious, like if we were going to do a mastication effort or a prescribed burn effort, for our habitat projects, we get out there and we survey for special status species and nesting birds and all of that. I'm assuming that we'd still have to do all of that. Like you can't just say there's no special status species without going out and looking. And as you said, CNDDB is not an assurance that there isn't a special status species.
Yeah, and so that's the benefit of the ecoregions, right? So your project is within an area in that larger ecoregion map that I showed, and there's a table that actually outlines like the different plant and animal species, two separate tables that could potentially be in your project area, and it breaks it down by the different habitats that they would be in. So you don't have to analyze like every species in that ecoregion table. You might be able to take some out because you don't have like any waterways. So like all the fish, bye, or anything that is in that like upper wetland area, you wouldn't necessarily need to analyze, but it gives you a list of those species that could be there to help narrow it down for you so that you're not having an impact. And then in the bio, I don't bring the bio impact up because there's a lot to it, but it does actually dive. There's, I want to say 3 or 4 impacts or mitigation measures, excuse me, that are specific to specific species to make sure that you're not having an impact on them.
And then
Great.
just one of the things I've been pointing out to the units that are working with the VTP as well, the CNDDB search is what we use and what we traditionally used. When the VTP was written, because it was used across a broad scale, not everybody uses the CNDDB database or even knows about it. So they had to develop a species list within the EIR itself to kind of give people guide. One of the things that if you are familiar with using the CNDDB list, I always refer to that as my local, more site-specific search for those presence of those species. And then, of course, we always do the habitat elimination dance that we need to do. If we don't have serpentine soils, we don't have water courses, we don't, that species, we're not within the elevational range of that species, we do that habitat elimination process. But I always refer to the ecoregion as well. And then what I tend to do is I highlight everything in the ecoregions I had in my CNDDB, and then I look at the habitat constraints for the ecoregions ones, and you can use generally a blanket statement as to why these particular species, you've eliminated from consideration, without going through a huge dialogue of reasons for each individual species. So when I find that people do that, it runs a little bit smoother. Shannon?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to touch back on Lucas's question, just because it was one I told him I needed to read and I would come back to. So he wanted to hear more about lead and responsible agencies are defined for tiering off of a programmatic EIR. So I hope I answered that a little bit. And then, and if you were legally challenged on tiering off of a programmatic EIR, who is challenged in the legal action? The lead agency who has the programmatic EIR or the one tiering off of it, or both, depending on the specific challenge. So right now, like, so when the PER was finally approved, that was challenged. It's still under litigation, but we can utilize it. So it has been challenged. But usually, when you are challenged on it, it's usually the project proponent because it is specific to your specific project and something specifically within your project. So hopefully that answers that question.
And I think, did we answer the question or did somebody, I think Lucas had another question early on.
Yeah, I answered his question in the very beginning.
Oh, okay, great.
Sorry to have been wordy there. I do have one other question, maybe since most of us are, or probably all of us are really coming from the LNU unit specifically, I'm just kind of curious if there's examples from this unit where you're kind of saying occasionally, the PEIR is not the right approach and you may have to go the mitigated NEGDEC approach. Are there like specific cases that you can speak to where that has come up kind of in our bioregion?
So there have been no EIRs that have required a NEGDEC or a mitigated NEGDEC so far. Everything has been within the project specific analysis. There have been some that have done addendums, but yeah, none that have other environmental documents. The Coastal Conservancy has a project that was approved that is available on the board's website. So all of the projects, once they've been approved, that PSA is on the board's website. So that one is there. And then I do know that there's another one that is being written, and forgive me because I can't remember the group's name, but it's out of Marin. I don't know that they've finalized it yet, but I do know that they're working on one. And then we will be working on one for Las Posadas as well. So those are three that I can think of off the top of my head, but none of them actually have a mitigated NEGDEC or other CEQA document attached.
Yeah, I believe Tim Holliday with the Lake Napa unit's working with some of, I thought maybe some of you folks on a VTP as well. So he might be a good source of contact to find out specifically to your question, but I haven't seen anything like Shannon that's come across our desk that would indicate where mitigated native deck or another type of analysis would have to take place.
So, Catherine, you're asking, could you speak a bit more about the LRA addendums for prescribed burns that we might want to implement outside of the SRA area? So there's some examples on the board's website of addendums to include in the local responsibility area. It's the same analysis that you're doing for within the state responsibility area. You're just adding a little bit more information in saying that, yeah, it's outside of the treatable landscape. However, the treatments that we're implementing are within the scope of the programmatic EIR because they've been analyzed in the PEIR, and the fuel types are also the same within the PEIR analysis.
You're just trying to draw a nexus between this imaginary line on the ground where your vegetation and everything is exactly the same. So we use the word ground truthing, just give a good picture and a good description of nothing's really changed from one side of the line to the other, and it's on a landscape level, and they it fits within. We advise our folks to, if it fits within the fire plan model that you have, then make sure you mention that kind of stuff, especially if your vegetation type and your environmental conditions don't change.
So if there's no other questions, I will jump into my next presentation unless people want to take a short, like 5-minute break.
And sorry, I do have one more question. This is Lucas. I'm kind of curious. So I didn't get to see that table in great detail, but I'll look it up with the species and ecoregions that you pointed out. It just looked a little blurry on my screen, but I'll check it out.
Tiny writing.
Yeah.
It's really tiny.
There have been some ideas being floated around in our area. Our Napa Communities Firewise Foundation, for instance, has thought about developing kind of like a cheat sheet for listed species and like kind of, being able to kind of look into ecoregion and kind of narrow it down quickly. So for like, say doing like tons of roadside projects in a bunch of different areas of the county, how can you kind of improve efficiency? I'm just kind of curious, I haven't explored it in great depth with them, but they've been working with a plant ecologist on like some aspects of that. Have you seen an example of something like that done? Do you guys do something like that for units? Any kind of like things that improve efficiency that you think work well that aren't, cutting too many corners?
Outside of the Cal VTP?
Yeah,
Or
because even for like a NOE, kind of knowing quickly, again, doing your due diligence, at least a starting place.
I think some of our units have like an idea of the specific plants and animals that are within their area. But I think that if you don't have anything and you want a good starting point, like the ecoregion is a good list to build off of, because it is broken down into those larger geographical areas. Again, they are a little bit long and tiny text, but it's a good starting point for you to be able to utilize.
So some of the units have developed species lists. Of course, those were developed off of the CNDDB list of what, like Shannon said, what was most commonly located in their area and that they had to address. Those lists of species generally came from, what they were familiar with from the forest practice side of the world. They moved the species over. And what they did is simply created a list that said whether the species was rare, threatened, or endangered, a species of a special concern. And then they basically wrote a dialogue about the habitat constraints that were important for that species and tried to group the species by those habitat constraints. So I use serpentine soils a lot because there's not a lot of serpentine soils everywhere. So some units have taken the habitat elements that are required and just grouped those species that are important to serpentine soils. So when I do this serpentine, or when I do my soils analysis, if I don't have serpentine soils, that whole group I can move off to the side now is not into consideration. Some have done it by elevation, some have done it by wet areas and marshes and water courses. I've actually encouraged the units over time to try to start doing that with the ecoregions as well, because that species list is gotten bigger. But the ecoregions does provide some habitat element language already in it. So if you actually read through the ecoregions, and you'll read the habitat elements that you would put in there for your. So it might be kind of already done when you look at the ecoregions a little bit closer. They were a lot more user friendly than I thought they were when I had to use them. And I tried to avoid them the first time, and the lawyers said, no, you got to use them. So I just went with the CNDDB, and then that's where I started using theirs. And once I figured out how to kind of dovetail the two together, it worked pretty well. And they do have the habitat elements in there that should give you kind of what you're already looking for, I think.
Yeah, we'll just chime in here. One of the thoughts I had listening to the dialogue there is it might be worth it if you don't see a tool in there to develop that tool, those local, if you know you have issues with a certain species type, to say, hey, this is our process. And so that's where the CEQA, I think, has some flexibility, because CAL FIRE, our system is pretty established. We know what we're going to do from the unit level on up through region to Sacramento. But when it comes to the local RCDs, they're autonomous agencies that have discretionary authority. So you're able to build out your programs for how you attack these potential roadblocks. And so working through that, I think building your own toolbox for how you're going to disclose that information may be prudent. And so there's obviously where you can't come up with your own, you can beg, borrow, and steal. It's kind of the way we get through this together is we share resources and tools, but tailoring those tools to your own ecoregion, I think, could be a very viable tool. So I'd be curious to see what you come up with actually for studying those kind of sensitive communities, plants and animals. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, for the north up here, when you look at the ecoregions, a lot of stuff can be eliminated because we're in the very far north end of the ecoregions, and they tend to run north to south through the state. As you get closer to your area, the species list probably gets a little bit larger than we do, because we can eliminate a lot of those species are shown within your area. They have the habitat elements that your area has, where we don't have that. So it's a good exercise for sure. It's time consuming, but you know, on the end, you have a pick list that you can go from and just go quickly. Yeah, I don't have this habitat in my project. I don't have this habitat in my project. And you can move through things fairly quickly. It's really that process of elimination.
Any other questions? Probably should move on and just so I can get through the last one, then we'll have questions at the end too, before we sign off. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen again. Someone could tell me if they see this or not.
Yep, I see you, Shannon.
Okay. All right. So CAL FIRE and CEQA, how do we fit into this whole process now that we've bombarded you with like CEQA generalities? You know, what do we do? So in this presentation, I'm going to touch on our California Climate Investment Grants. So those are our CCI grants. Give a little background on them because some of you may not realize where they originate from, and the objectives of each one of those grants, and then CEQA's role within them. And then I'm going to touch on our Cultural Resource Management Program, and then just how best to partner with the units. So in fiscal year 2021, there was $294 million allocated for some of our CCI grant programs. So that's our Forest Health, our Forest Legacy, and Wildfire Prevention grants. So previously our fire prevention grants, they're now called our Wildfire Prevention grants, our CAL FIRE Urban and Community Forestry grants, and our research specific grants. So in this next fiscal year, they've been allocated $310 million. So as you can see, the funding is increasing for those grant programs. So those grant programs are based off of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So that's the GGRF, if you've ever heard of that term. So that cap and trade program began in 2012. It's market-based, so companies that hold emission allowances to cover those emissions or pollutants that that they're creating can buy and sell that stuff on the open market. Which then gives us money to go into that greenhouse gas reduction fund, and that's then appropriated based on Assembly Bill 32 for specific projects. So that AB 32, Assembly Bill 32, requires California to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, and helps mitigate risks associated with climate change while improving energy efficiency, expanding the use of renewable energy resources and cleaner transportation, and reducing waste. And again, those are based on those market-based programs. And the California Air Resources Board is actually the lead agency for that. And there's a link to their website. So the Forest Health Program. So the activities that are associated with that are usually forest fuel reduction. You can do prescribed fire, pest management, reforestation, biomass utilization, research, and then conservation, which is tied into the Forest Legacy program. And then there's the wildfire prevention program. So again, this used to be our fire prevention grants. They're now called wildfire prevention grants. And there's three main activities associated with this one. And so it's a forest fuels reduction, fire prevention planning, and then fire prevention education. And then we have our California Forest Legacy Program. So this helps to protect environmentally important forest land threatened with conversion to non-forest uses. And it just helps to ensure that there's a carbon storage sink within California. And it's usually conservation easements or a fee title associated with it. And then Forest Health also has the research program. So these are standalone research projects in support of goals of our forest carbon plan, and they try to identify outstanding questions, prioritize needs, and fund sound scientific studies. So it helps support forest landowners, resource agencies, and fire management organizations in California. So environmental compliance for all of these grants. So generally, if the applicant is a public agency, so we went into that definition before, they will assume the role of lead agency. So if the applicant is not a public agency, so Fire Safe Council, it could be one of those, then CAL FIRE will assume the role of a lead agency for the grant. If the project is on federal lands, they must also comply with NEPA along with CEQA. So, what else do I want to say on this one? So usually for our forest health grants, if you're a public agency, so if you're a resource conservation district, you will assume the role of the lead agency. Our fire prevention grants, we have a little bit more leeway with that. So just be cognizant of which grant you're applying for, and each grant has their own procedural guide, and it is based on each year. Each grant cycle has its own procedural guide. So please make sure that you're looking at the appropriate procedural guide for the appropriate year for the appropriate grant program. So why does CEQA apply? Again, John talked about this in his presentation, because it's a government action that may affect the environment, and the main focus for grants is that it supports. So we're providing funding to an entity to help carry out a project. So with all of our grant guidelines, the grantee must submit proof of the CEQA or NEPA within 1 year of execution of the grant agreement. And that's not necessarily that the CEQA has been completed, because for some, a mitigated neg deck may be required or something that takes a little bit longer to prepare, but at least that you've started it and you're showing that you're working towards the completion of CEQA. If you have not, then it's something where we could potentially reallocate the funds to another project. So how can you comply with CEQA for our grant programs? So you can do a notice of exemption, again, which was covered in John's, all these have been most covered in John's discussion. You could do an initial study, a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration, an environmental impact report. You could use a timber harvest permit or notice in compliance with the California Forest Rules and Act. They are very specific, though, when utilizing a timber harvest plan, because not all activities under a THP or a forest practice exemption might apply to your project. So if you are doing timber harvesting activities or something that utilizes a forest practice exemption, you're most likely also going to have to do a notice of exemption on top of it to cover those additional activities. Another CEQA document would be the finding of no significant impact based on an EIR. We do have the ability to do what's like a NEPA CEQA crosswalk with Senate Bill 901. So if you have, and this is done on a yearly basis based off of the Natural Resources Agency Secretary confirming that NEPA has not gone below the standards of CEQA. So as long as your NEPA document covers those project activities in that same project area, we would essentially file an exemption for CEQA, saying that all of those impacts have already been analyzed. So where the grantee is the public agency and exempt projects, you would be responsible for preparing that notice of exemption and filing it and making sure that all of your like the due diligence has been done. And where the projects are non-exempt, then you would be performing that necessary environmental analysis and environmental documents, filing those notices and actually paying those fees as well. Grants usually cover the reimbursement because in your budget you're putting something in for environmental compliance, so you would be reimbursed for the filing fees. And then where CAL FIRE is the lead agency, you're going to work closely with the unit to make sure that the environmental documents reflect your independent judgment. So making sure that you have done your due diligence to make sure that you're utilizing the appropriate environmental document. We will provide you with guidance on what, based on your project description and all of your analysis, if your project falls within that, either that categorical exemption, or whether or not we think that it might be good to work towards a mitigated negative declaration, which is why it's important to work closely with the unit as soon as possible. Ideally, the unit already knows about your project, because when the grants are being rated, the units are one of the first ones to do the analysis on them. So what are some approaches to doing the CEQA? You can go through your city planning department to have the CEQA filed. You could go through the county to have it filed. Again, the Forest Service would handle NEPA, and then the CAL FIRE unit. So we could, sometimes we have projects that fit under our vegetation management program. So our CMP, our chaparral management programmatic EAR, that's working closely with the unit. A notice of exemption utilizing the Cal VTP, or maybe even our forest improvement program. And then each one of these have different timelines associated with them. So for CAL FIRE, we have as Dan kind of talked about in his slideshow, there's different processes that we go through. So for our documents, they start at the unit, they'll go to region for review, they'll come to me for final, and then I get final signature and then posting on them. So each one of those hits a desk and then gets looked at and then gets moved through the process, versus, the RCD going directly through city or county planning department. You're not having to go through each one of those checks and balances. So your project will get approved on a quicker time frame. So this kind of ties us into our cultural resource management program. So for all environmental documents where CAL FIRE is the lead agency, excluding timber harvesting permits and notices, our cultural resources must be assessed per the processes outlined in our archaeological review procedures for CAL FIRE projects. And that is available on our CAL FIRE resource management webpage. So this kind of ties into, someone asked a question, I'm going to touch on it now, on tribal notification versus public notification. There is a difference. So for us, all of our projects, even if it's a notice of exemption per our archaeological review procedures, unless it's an exempt practice under our archaeological review procedures, which is a whole nother story, we do notify the tribes. So that we have their input, because we're required to, based off of a memorandum of understanding that we have with the Office of Historic Preservation. So there is a difference between tribal notification and public notification. For resource non-CAL FIRE entities not utilizing our procedural guide, that are doing categorical exemptions, because this is another question that was asked, does AB 52 apply? For categorical exemptions, no, because it's under the auspice that your project is exempt, and it's not going to have an impact on the environment. You do need to do AB 52 for a negative declaration, mitigated negative declaration, or an EAR. AB 52 was already completed for the VTP. However, there are still specific requirements that you have to do for cultural resources in those SPRs and mitigation measures. That was quite a tangent. I apologize. So our cultural resource management program. So CAL FIRE currently has 9 state archaeologist positions. We have 3 assigned to our northern region, 3 assigned to our southern region, and then 3 assigned to our headquarters. Currently, we only have 6 of those positions filled. So they help support our local and statewide activities that may affect cultural resources throughout the whole department. So it's not just all fuel reduction projects. They also are dealing with timber harvest plans, with building, so our tech services projects, so building new fire stations, air attack bases, station maintenance. They deal with everything. So they are 6 people who are very overworked. So we have utilized Sonoma State University to help assist with our grant program review on projects. So just so you're aware, I know some of you may have dealt with issues in the past of the archaeology for CAL FIRE lead agency projects taking a long time. We have tried to remedy that by utilizing Sonoma State. So all of the contact information for archaeologists are available on our CAL FIRE webpage, and here's a link to it here. So why do we look at cultural resources? We look at it because each resource is unique, and for tribes, it might be the sole source of information about their past. History is also limited on certain things, so we take another look at it. The knowledge belongs to the different tribes and to everyone. And, some of that information just may not be available, and we're trying to preserve it. And it's things that aren't always renewable or can be easily overlooked. And specific resources have a specific meaning to different tribes in different areas. So we want to make sure that, we're preserving that for them. And it's not necessarily just sites, but then there's also plants that might have important, values to them as well. Or view sheds that might have important values to them. So one of the things the department has is, again, that I touched on that we have to follow is our archaeological procedures for CAL FIRE projects. So in order for us to utilize this, there is the cultural resource training, and that is provided by the California Licensed Foresters Association. So if you're going to be working on a CAL FIRE project, you can sign up for this training. There is a wait list for it. It's over a year long because they only offer the training twice a year. So if it's something that as the Resource Conservation District, you're going to be working closely with your units either through direct awards or grants, it's something that you could potentially benefit from. However, this training can only be used for CAL FIRE projects. Forest practice also applies for the training, but you cannot use it for projects that aren't funded by CAL FIRE or like that we have no involvement in. So this kind of allows our staff who've been through the training to go out and kind of like get a head start on the cultural resource review. So we were able to make the notifications, get information center requests or requests from the information center on what potentially is out there, and start writing up an actual report on any impacts that could occur. So as I said, there's that cultural resources guide, and that's used for our CAL FIRE projects. If you are doing anything that is timber harvest related, you have to follow the forest practice rules. You want to make sure that you're using the appropriate procedural guide, because the forest practice rules have different time frames and documents than our cultural resources procedures. One of them has the confidential archaeological addendum. Another one has the archaeological survey report. You have 15-day notifications versus 30-day notifications. So you really want to make sure that you're using that appropriate one. And then, like CEQA, you always have to make sure you're planning. So this is the flow chart for the different projects that are possible for archaeology. Again, this is specific to CEQA, not forest practice rules. That one has a whole different flow chart. But as you can see, there's a process that you have to go through. So you always want to make sure that you're allowing enough time to have an adequate survey or preliminary study for cultural resources. You have the tribal notifications, actually doing the surveys, doing the research, compiling the report, having our staff or Sonoma State review it to make sure that it's appropriate and adequate prior to getting archaeological clearance. And again, we are short-staffed, so it does take some time. So make sure that you're starting this process as soon as possible. Which then ties us into partnerships with the units. So like, how can you work with on projects with your local unit? So the RCD could reach out to the local unit and work in cooperation with them, or we do have some units that have reached out directly to the RCDs to help us get projects on the ground, because we also have staffing shortages and are trying to increase the pace and scale, and know that the RCDs can assist us with that. You can work jointly on Cal VTP projects, or if you have landowners that are willing to participate. We also have our vegetation management plan, which is our chaparral management plan, EIR. So that's specific to the department and can only be utilized in the department, but can help get projects on the ground. So again, remember when you're working with the units that you really want to get them involved in the processes early, especially for grants, because they are the ones who are going to be reviewing them. And if they have no knowledge of your project, then they're probably not going to. They potentially could not rank it as high as a project that they're already aware of and they've been involved in the planning phases for. And then also remember that our staff are also work on other things outside of fuel reduction, and we're an all-risk department. So like fire seasons may delay their ability to help you work on a project, getting things reviewed or getting things implemented. And then here's just again, a list of the contacts within the unit. So, and it was broken down by the pre-fire versus the forest practice. Just because I did touch on that, I did want to make sure that people know that they can reach out to Kim Sohn, who's the unit forester and focuses on that. Or they can reach out to Tim Holiday or Ian or Rochelle for the pre-fire or fuel reduction projects. There's also additional resources that you can go to for grants or other projects for other agencies. So the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force is a good one to see what other departments are working on. And then our CAL FIRE grants webpage, because we do have some new grants that will be coming up. We have like our workforce development grants. I think we're in our first or second year of those. And then we'll also be having some involvement with tribal grants as well. So that is the end of all of our presentations. This would be, I guess I can look and see if there's any additional questions that have come up.
I don't see any, Shannon.
Okay, so does anyone have any other questions that they would like to bring up? We've got about 20 minutes left in our training available. Or if they want to see anything, I mean, I can walk you through the board's website if you like, or any to show you where things are, or our webpage. I mean, just let me know. Okay, I'm reading a question from Catherine and see if I can. Oh, she was asking if a recording was available. Okay.
Yeah, just to confirm for everyone, a recording will be available. For some reason, maybe Teams just stops recording after a certain amount of time, so I think it'll be in 2 installments. And I also just wanted to ask if we could either get, PDFs of your presentations so that we can click all those links in there. Okay, cool.
Yep, I can provide you with PDFs for, well, I mean, at least for mine, and then if you want, John and Dan can do the same thing.
Yeah, it looks like there were lots of useful resources in there that we'll want to click into. This maybe, so I don't know about this question, but so one argument I've heard in favor of doing the CalVTP is it's this broader time frame. You can maybe if you have a multi-year project that you're going to be working on, that you can do some of the the surveying and all of that up front, but then you would need to renew or redo certain parts of surveying within like 1 year of when you'll do the implementation of those activities. Could you just talk a little bit about the time frame? And maybe I have some of this information wrong too.
No, so some surveys are required prior to, depending on what you're looking at. So if CAL FIRE is not the lead agency, especially for archaeology, then you're just doing like a pedestrial survey. You're not having to do like the full surveys prior to project implementation. For biological, it depends upon the species and the activity that you're completing, but you would potentially need to redo surveys prior to entry to make sure that you're not like anything hasn't moved in, similar to like nesting birds and things like that. And I mean, that's for most CEQA documents as well. You're going to go back in prior to operations just to make sure, you don't have any new species that have popped up or anything that's like, oh, hey, now that you've, modified this habitat, this is a much better place for me to hang out. So there is some of that involved, yes.
Yeah, it's important to remember that these animals are transient. So a year goes by and you do increase or improve habitat, that there's likely something that could enter your area and be there in a year. The other thing to remember is we're supposed to be addressing rare, threatened, endangered species of special concern. Those lists do change periodically through state and federal actions. So sometimes species that are on there may not be on there anymore, or species that were petitioned to be put on those lists could get on there. So even with the ecoregion list, I think there's a caveat, if I remember right, Shannon, that reminds people that these lists can change and there be new species that can be added or taken away from those lists. So it is important to always kind of remember, as the project goes on over the years and you get into different phases of the projects, to do your due diligence and just have it in your back pocket that you did something to double check to make sure nothing new has occurred since you initiated the project.
Yep.
Question about the archaeology, because Tim Holiday brings that up a lot. It's like a real it's a pinch point in getting things done efficiently. There's just not enough people working in that space. So say like, RCDs or clerk nonprofits are working with CAL FIRE on a project, and we, hire an archaeologist, a commercial archaeologist consulting to do that part of the CEQA. Is CAL FIRE still obligated to, review it with the state archaeologist or regional archaeologist on your staff? And so like, is there still that slowdown, or is that process made more efficient? Because
It depends.
okay.
I love that answer. It depends. So if you're using our archaeological procedures guide and you have an RPF that is using that surveyor certificate, then we are obligated to review it to make sure it's in compliance with our procedural guide. If you are using a consultant, our archaeologists like to look at it to make sure that the treatments in the areas are at least covered, but it doesn't necessarily go through the same review as one that is utilizing our certificate.
And do you know if consulting archaeologists in this region, Northern California, typically have your certificate too? Is that something
No,
that
so
we
it's
should be looking
different.
for?
No,
Okay.
because if it's a consultant, then they have like the professional training and the knowledge to actually complete. They've like been through the schooling to do the proper analysis. Our training's 5 days. So that's why our archaeologists are like, no, we need to look at this to make sure that you understood what we were asking you to do and you've done
Yeah.
everything to our, yeah. So no, it's you don't need to make sure that the consultants have been through our training.
And then maybe this is another question. We've sometimes heard, and I know it's probably different in every single county and area, but just the culture around this. But we've sometimes heard from our county planning department in Napa that they don't want to serve as a lead agency. And there's been a little bit of like back and forth, like, CAL FIRE should take this one on. And no, county should take this one on. And the county sometimes pushes back and says, well, we have no discretion over this project or whatever, no connection to this sort of project. That's not always the case in some of the projects that I've seen. Like, for instance, they've actually funded some of the work, so they're a funder, even if it's like PG&E settlement money, but it's run through the county and the county doles that money out. Or say like in a roadside situation, if county has to manage through roads, public works, the actual road closure, lane closure, or whatever. Obviously, there's all these different ways that county can be involved. So I'm just kind of curious if you've heard anything, and anything you can speak to on helping us like navigate that, if that comes up with our local county.
I have had it happen once where the county had told a grantee that they wouldn't be willing to be the lead agency for them. And then the grantee also couldn't be its own lead agency. And we worked with them to provide more information to the county, and then they just essentially had to talk to the right person to where they're like, oh no, now we understand what you were trying to do, and we're willing to take on that lead agency role. I have not come across any other instances where the county has just flat out said no. Because a lot of the times, especially with roadside clearings, the county will already have either an ordinance or a CEQA document prepared where the grantee can utilize it. So then they're essentially getting the work done for free. And then we don't have to be the lead, and the grantee can go to work a lot quicker. But if you do encounter that, I highly recommend that you reach out to your unit as soon as possible so that we can let the grants know so that we can help you navigate through that process.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
If
Well,
no
that's
one
good.
else has questions, I have many.
Go ahead. We've got 13 more minutes.
All right. So we have an ecological reserve in Solano County that is outside the main area that's been designated as a place where prescribed burning would take place, outside the SRA. It is grasslands. Is something like that something that that we would be able to do an addendum? It does not it doesn't share a boundary line with the SRA. It would be, you know, further out in our county, out into the grasslands areas. Does that seem like something likely that the addendum would work for?
It depends on what the habitat type is within the area, making sure, you know, it's not an estuary, wet meadows, things like that, because those are specifically excluded from the VTP. So you would probably need to file like a mitigated neg deck for something along those lines. So without seeing a map of it on the treatable landscape, I can't say a solid yes or no, but as long as it falls within the treatable landscape and it is one of the habitat types, it would be something that you could do an addendum for. So the only thing is you also have to make sure that you have SRA. So I probably should have said that too. Like there's not a set amount of like, well, 50% of it must be SRA in order for it to qualify. You need to make sure you have an SRA component to your project in order to utilize the VTP.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Shannon, I guess I'd just follow up with, can we run specific things by you? Are you available for consultation for these kinds of questions?
So there is an email, I believe it's CalVTP projects at it's either bof.ca.gov or at fire.ca.gov, but it is on the Board of Forestry's website. Please email them first to see if they have a response. They usually email me, but because CAL FIRE is not, we didn't write we were involved in the process of, but it's not our document. So we try to have the Board of Forestry work through it first before we respond. It's a very political answer.
And I did just throw that email link into the chat there. So there it is.
And the VTP is new, so the units are learning it. We learn it. We learn a little bit more about it every time it gets used, and someone provides information. So it's really good to use the Board of Forestry email address because being their document, it allows them to see where things are occurring and how people are either processing or what they need to know versus that. And then those kind of things will show up hopefully in our frequently asked questions or we'll get answers to them on a regular basis. Also understand the units are learning the VTP as well. So, converse and share that information with the units. And quite often, a lot of times the units will call me to confirm something and then I actually learn something new or, go and ask Shannon about it. So definitely use that Board of Forestry. Let them know since it's their document, the kind of things you need to know from that VTP.
And they are, there is a frequently asked questions document on the board's webpage, and we are working on updating that to have some more of the more recent questions that have come up be addressed on it as well, because that one is from when it first came out. So they are working on updating that and they're constantly providing new information on that webpage as questions arise.
Well, it seems like maybe we've tapped out the questions. Everyone's brains are probably a little fried, but thank you all so much for the time you put into this presentation. It was super, super helpful, and I know will be a great reference for us all as we continue to move forward on our work. So yeah, really, really appreciate all your time.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you
Thank
guys.
you all.
Good luck and look forward to projects down the road. So thank you.
Thank you.